So, hi guys. Couple of things. First of all, I actually have a drink ready for this one because I have a feeling I'm going to be talking for a while. Lord knows I was talking longer during motion picture than I actually intended to. But, I'm just going to say it was hard to see the death scene in this movie, and that's all I'm going to say about that. If by some bizarre reason you haven't actually watched this movie, if you have any interest in any literary style movies, good science fiction movies, good character-driven movies, that kind of a thing, I strongly recommend this movie. If by some reason you haven't already watched it. If you have watched it and didn't like it, that's okay. That's understandable. These are my notes. This is the first page of my notes. This is the second page of my notes. This is the third page of my notes. And this is the fourth page of my notes. Be ye warned. This first page all goes up to the 9-minute and 21-second mark of the movie. I'll talk about that when we get there. Star Trek the Motion Picture had funding, backing, interest, engaged people, fans of the show, and a lot of support from Paramount and from Roddenberry himself. Star Trek 2 had none of that. I mean, it didn't have none of that, but it had virtually none of that. Star Trek the Motion Picture's budget was huge, and they went over budget. Star Trek 2's budget was pathetically tiny. Like, by the day's standards, and if you count for inflation, most movies are not made for this little money. You wouldn't know it, though. I mentioned how the effects had aged quite well in motion picture. I have to give huge props, because in my opinion, the effects have aged astonishingly well in Wrath of Khan. Granted, I've always been a fan of model work and puppet work in general when it's done well. See Empire Strikes Back, anything from Farscape, that kind of a thing is a good example of that. But I do genuinely feel this movie has aged very well. And it's no surprise why, because this was the Star Trek, the first Star Trek, but certainly not the last, done by ILM, otherwise known as Industrial Light and Magic. If that doesn't mean anything to you, they're the company that was founded by Star Wars. It was a lot of young people who were passionate about doing that kind of graphic design work and really pushing the edge of what graphics could do in movies at the time. They basically innovated half of the industry, if not more, in terms of graphic design and special effects over the course of at least 2 decades, debatably more. So yeah, they did some really good stuff with this movie. But another interesting thing about Star Trek II for me is they brought in a lot of relative unknowns to work on it. People who would basically be untried and tested, but they didn't do so wantonly. Three names I want to toss at you. Harve Bennett, Nicholas Meyer, and Michael Miner. Now, all three of these people are amazingly talented individuals who have tremendous passion and great attention to detail and are really put that effort onto the screen. Nobody really knew that at the time. All three of these people were relatively untested and relatively early on in their careers. The difference between this and something that will happen many years later with regards to Star Trek Nemesis is that in Nemesis, they brought in people because there were corporate reasons to do so that were untested and untried. They were like, here, do this because that way we can make a deal with you, or this way it'll be cheaper, or this other movie will be cheaper to make, or for contract stipulations. In Wrath of Khan, they brought in these new people who had never done this and never tried this because a lot of they looked at these people and said, this person's going to be successful. This person genuinely cares about what they're doing, and the early works I've seen them work on show real promise. Anybody who's seen me talk about fledgling writers knows what I mean by that phrase. But for those of you who haven't, shows promise means whatever you wrote or did or directed or whatever, it sucks. Because you're new, you don't have the experience. But the fact that it shows promise shows there is genuine potential and skill underneath. There's some kind of passion or caring or otherwise just plain skill, however you want to define that, that is underneath the surface. And if you are given the chance to really do something with that, you'll make great stuff. And so the people in charge of Paramount and making this movie looked at Nicholas Miner, Harve Bennett, and Michael Miner and said, come work on our film. And lo and behold, they were right. These three people will also be working on another amazing, incredible film. And in fact, one of my favorite films of all time. Which brings me to another point. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, is often considered one of the best movies of all time. Period. Regardless of genre. In science fiction movies, it is often considered, at the very least, tied for the best science fiction movie of all time. There's a lot of debate about that, and I, of course, don't want to presume to just say that it's the best movie of all time, because all I can do is give my opinion, and I've heard many, many different opinions on this. But in my personal category, everyone's seen my video game things, right? How I categorize it by top 100 and top 20. In other words, the art category, things that I think are great, and then the absolute best of the best of the best category, which is that top 20. More accurately described as a top 28 now. In terms of films, I do the exact same thing. I do the same thing with films, books, movies, etc. It's just the way my mind categorizes. Star Trek II is without question in the top 28 category, or whatever you want to call it. The best of the best of the best. And it shows in every pore of this movie. This is one of those rare treats where I enjoyed it when I was younger. When this came out, I was pretty young. But I liked it even still. And I liked watching it when we got the VHS copy. But when I rewatched this as an adult, I went many, many years without rewatching the Star Treks. Right up until sometime in the 2000s. So we're talking a little over a decade of not actually watching the Star Trek movies. And then I went back and rewatched it, and all that experience and age and growth and, frankly, having a bit more of a brain, now that I'm older, made me go back and realize, oh my God, it really was incredibly amazing. Now, I know that sounds weird, but as I've often said, and as I've discussed about at length, and will discuss probably in the future even still, nostalgia is best defined as perceiving things through a different lens, and therefore using that altered lens instead of your current lens in order to determine your opinion on something. For example, if I enjoyed A when I was young, I will not necessarily enjoy A now, but I might think I do, or I might champion that I do, or I might say I do, because I remember enjoying it through this lens when I was younger, as opposed to this lens, right? Now, I've actually argued against this, but only because I actually have nothing against nostalgia, and I've talked about that as well. I argue against it because I really hate the argument of, it's not good, you only like it because of nostalgia, because that by itself is a fallacy in its argument. Saying it's not good is by definition giving your opinion on it. So in your opinion it is not good, and therefore the only reason I could like it is because of nostalgia, is just blatant irrelevancy. That's literally just throwing away all possible variables and just slothing over it with this generic thing saying, you don't agree with me, therefore you're wrong. And I hate that argument, and I always have. But one of the things I love is going back to something I liked as a kid, or as a teenager, or whatever, and rewatching it, or replaying it, and realizing, or it's hard to explain how this works in my brain, but it's like, imagine for a moment, I'll use a really dumb analogy. Imagine you're looking at a painting, and you look at this painting and you're like, oh, that's a cool looking painting. Now imagine you go off and you do years of art school and you start painting yourself and you do all this stuff and you grow in experience and understanding of the genre and how it works. And you go back years and years and years later and you see that same painting and it's like, oh my God, this is an amazing painting. Because you never noticed the way they used the brush strokes. You never noticed how he actually did that one little technique in order to create different feeling textures from aspects of the paint and by using different styles of brush strokes. You never noticed how he used different styles of paint on the same canvas in order to create a atmosphere of inequality. You never noticed how he put all these tiny little details into the background of the painting to help flesh it out. Things you wouldn't even notice if you weren't paying attention. You know, there's so much more there, so it's still a great painting, but now you understand why it's a great painting. And that's the feeling I got when I rewatched this movie. I will never let go of that memory. When I rewatched Star Trek II for the first time in like over a decade, this was again several years ago, I rewatched it and I was blown away. Because this movie is amazing. And now I can try to articulate why it's amazing. I can see the subtleties, the details, the nuances. You know why there's this 9-minute, 21-second mark on my notes? Because I was writing down every little detail as I went, because I wanted to express how many of them there were. And there were so many. I had to stop myself, because at this point, I might as well just put the movie up and do like a lore run with you know, the backdrop here as the movie and me. And I'm just like, okay, now pay attention to this, and pay attention to that, and pausing the movie constantly while doing it. Fun fact, it's actually been asked of me to do lore runs of movies before. I have declined because of copyright law. That's the only reason, by the way. But as an addendum to that, for anybody who's curious, I actually do that with my sister all the time. When she and I are watching movies together, I will lore run the movie with her and discuss this and debate this and pause it as she asks questions and explain things for her. And it's worth noting I'm not imposing. My sister wants me to do this, and if she ever doesn't, she will say so, and I will shut up. But, and of course, she'll give her own comments and thoughts as well, which is great, getting that kind of feedback, which is what happens during lore runs. If you've paid attention during any of them, I engage with my audience constantly, because I'm not just trying to give my thoughts on this, but also get your guys' thoughts in as well. The point is, I do that all the time in real life. I just thought I'd share that thing. I would love to do a lore run of this movie, but again, I'm not risking that. Regardless, let's talk about those three names I just talked about. I'm going to be talking about Michael Miner in a little bit. Harv Bennett is the guy who actually wrote the script, but Nicholas Meyer is the one who wrote the screenplay. Now, you might not know the full difference between those two. Basically, the script is made from the screenplay, is probably the simplest way I could describe that. But let me talk about that screenplay just a moment, because Meyer crafted... Okay, let me rewind a little bit here. When they... Star Trek 1, the motion picture, was still a financial success. It didn't succeed as much as they wanted to do, but it was a financial success. It was a critical failure. Most of the executives in charge looked at this movie, Star Trek 2, and said, wring the cash out of it. It's a very common thing, especially in that day and era, and it's actually kind of a common thing nowadays. If a franchise has become damaged, squeeze whatever money you can out of it, and then move on. Some of the people did not agree with that, and Harv Bennett is actually a really good example of someone, because he was actually an executive at Paramount at this time, and he said, no, let's do something with this. And so he and a lot of other people got together, and they worked to create a script that was interesting, is all I'm going to say about that. Keep in mind, at this point, Roddenberry had been kicked upstairs, formally and officially, basically had his hands out of development. In fact, in all the behind-the-scenes material I read, and by the way, there is a lot of behind-the-scenes material on Wrath of Khan, way more than motion picture. I will not be covering all of it for those same basic reasons. I don't want to discuss that at full detail. I highly recommend you go look into it if you can. There's tons of interviews, tons of little written books and behind-the-scenes stuff. It's all over the place. It's fascinating stuff if you're interested in film geekery like I am. But Roddenberry basically had his hands off of that except for one thing. And all those things, I only saw one tidbit that Roddenberry actually influenced, and maybe a second. We'll talk about that later. So he was pushed out of the way, for good and for bad. And Bennett sat down and was trying, okay, we need to make this story happen. And so he wanted a central villain, and Khan came up almost immediately. And it's understandable why. If we look at The Next Generation, who is the nemesis of Picard? Well, it's the Borg. I mean, I'm not even going to fast forward. It is obvious. Who's the nemesis for Sisko? Who's the nemesis for... well, okay, Janeway didn't actually get a nemesis in the strictest sense of the word. They tried to make the Borg Queen a nemesis for her, but it didn't really work. But the point is, in many of the Star Trek works, this goes for Enterprise as well, you can name a major secondary character who is an antagonist, who is the nemesis of the main character. The original series didn't really have that in any sense of the word, except for one character. There was only one character who really felt like he was Kirk's equal. And I mean that, I say that very distinctly, because there are many creatures that were, you know, godlike entities and powerful people and lords over all this domain and all that fun stuff. But Khan was a man who had much better superiority overall to Kirk, but far less in terms of experience or understanding of the situation. And so we had hit someone who basically was the kind of person Kirk would be if Kirk had decided to use his ambition, his drive, his skill, his knowledge, etc., for his own selfish purposes, right? He was in many ways a wonderful foil to Kirk. And that's one of the reasons why it works so well, and indeed works so well in this movie. So Khan came up almost immediately, and they're like, okay, we'll use Khan. Lots of different stories happened. They had this one where there was going to be this whole thing about his son leading a revolt against the Federation, and it turns out it was actually Khan behind the whole thing. They had this whole thing where they were going to do a little time travel thing for a while there. A bunch of different stories. It's debatable how many scripts were actually written at this point in time. I should say screenplays. But of all these, there are several, quite a few. None of them were really clicking with the creators. And right about this time, Nicholas Meyer was brought on board, and Nicholas Meyer looked at all the scripts, got Bennett, got a few of the other people in on the room, got all the scripts in one room, went through all of them over the course of several days, went through every single one of them, and he did something that I agree with, and I cannot possibly emphasize how much I agree with this mentality, okay? He lifted the ideas from the scripts, not the words on the page. He took the ideas from the like several different scripts that he really enjoyed, pulled those ideas, jotted those ideas down as notes, and then wrote his own script with those ideas. Now, the key difference here, a lot of people will do this type of thing in modern Hollywood, but they won't actually do what he literally did. They will take bits and pieces of scripts and then shove them together. In fact, they did this in the motion picture. I've talked about this on Voyager several times, where they mash scripts together in exactly the same fashion. And it shows every time. What Meyer did is exactly what I agree with. It takes more time, without question. It's much harder. But Meyer wanted only the ideas from the pages, and so that all the words on the page would be written by one hand and therefore have the same tone and flow to them. And I agree with that tremendously. And it really shows why Meyer was the right guy to do this movie. So Meyer then sat down and wrote his screenplay, his original teleplay of this thing. And here's the really interesting fact, okay? His screenplay was quoted by at least 3 people that I could read about as untouchable. Now, let me explain what that means. Most of the time you put out a screenplay and they're like, okay, let's change this, let's edit this, there needs to be more action, there needs to be more sex, there needs to be more violence. Common things, right? There's executive meddling. It is incredibly common to the point where it is the norm. Even if it's not unwarranted, because sometimes you go into a script, it's like, well, okay, well, why don't we touch this up, or why don't we make this make more sense, or why don't we add more scenes with this character, There is a great deal of editing that goes into a screenplay, and it's not all bad. In fact, I would argue, at least amongst the good films that I tend to watch, most of it is overall a good thing. In some cases, I kind of wish they'd done that more. Cough, cough, Star Trek V, cough, cough. We'll get to that one. So, as he's going through this, everyone who read it said, nope, no changes. When I say untouchable, I mean it literally. As in, nobody wanted to actually change it. No changes, no adaptations, and then they were going to just put that straight to script, actually do the dialogue, and that was going to be what they were filmed. Well, as it turned out, 2 changes were made to this thing, okay? One of which I will be talking about literally at the end of this video. It's the very last note I have on page 4 there, so keep that in the back of your mind. The other one I'm going to talk about right now, and then I'm going to expand on it later, okay? For those of you who haven't seen this movie, this is your last chance to avoid any spoilers. Okay, 3, 2, 1. All right. Spock dies in this movie. Now that was always intended. Literally, that was one of the initial points that was put forward into the story, is that they needed to have a major character die, and Nimoy at this time, if you remember, really was antagonistic towards the Star Trek franchise in general. Really did not want to keep doing this job. So picking Spock to be the character to die was a logical choice. I'll talk about Nimoy's thing in a bit, by the way. So Spock was going to die, and the original death was going to happen much earlier in the film and basically tint the entire rest of the film in terms of tone and perspective. Well, a leak got out. Now, I want you to understand that this is the 80s, okay? Like the early 80s. We didn't really have the internet. We didn't really have anything, really. We had talking to people in person, occasional phone calls, and letter writing. But you have to understand that when this leak got out, it exploded across the Star Trek fan community. Just about every Star Trek fan, people were actually writing in letters to Paramount saying, no, you can't kill Spock. No, you can't kill Spock. This is where that other thing I mentioned earlier about Roddenberry comes in. To this day, to my knowledge, we don't know where this leak came from. It is very likely that as of now, we will never know where this leak came from for sure. But it was probably Roddenberry. Two big really points here. 3, actually. Number 1, Roddenberry was livid at this point in time for being ripped off of Star Trek. And it's understandable why. This was his baby, and he was taken away from it. Fully understandable why he'd be so upset about that. So no judgment here. Second reason, the idea of killing off Spock, who was his favorite character, by the way, in the original series, and someone that he adored, that several people he cared about adored as well, probably felt like a bit of a personal attack from his perspective. Now, it wasn't. Absolutely wasn't. Meyer never watched Star Trek, and Harve Bennett never watched Star Trek until they started working on this film. That's an interesting facet. As a small anecdote, Meyer didn't understand why everyone was really crying during Spock's scene. He didn't really understand the significance of it. All the people behind the scenes were crying during the recording of it because he had no emotional attachment to it. So this was not a spiteful attack on him, obviously, but it's easy to see why it could be perceived that way from Roddenberry's perspective. So Spock dying, being pulled off the project, and a third note. For those of you not aware, Gene Roddenberry has passed away. And for the record, yes, I did grieve for that. As much as I have talked negative about the man, he did some great stuff. And death is never really a good thing, at least in my opinion. So, yeah. But one of the things you tend to find here, at least in the West, as far as our cultural values go, is when someone dies, we are more likely to be positive about them, and we are less likely to badmouth them, unless they are considered a culturally acceptable target. See all the nasty rumors that came up about, what's his name? Mr. Rogers, when he passed away. Although it's worth noting those rumors were quenched and destroyed so utterly and violently because, again, we have this thing about not talking bad about the deceased. And it's understandable why, right? But my point is, after all this time has passed, now that we have entered the information age, a lot of people who worked on this film are still alive and have talked about it in modern eras. And yet no one has ever mentioned where this leak came from, at least that I've seen. Feel free to correct me if anybody else has any concrete information on this. It is likely based on these two facts. Roddenberry is dead. We don't like talking about the deceased. No one's ever come forward about it. That, again, it was probably him. Ironically, I think this is another example of Roddenberry doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. I'll talk more about that why later, but suffice it to say, they shifted the script around, and this is the first major change to the script, and so they had a scene at the beginning with Spock dying, which completely diffused the issue, and then they completely changed the structure in the latter half. Well, I shouldn't say they changed. It was very modular. They moved things here like this, so the structure remained the same, but Spock's actual death was moved to the end of the film as a climax rather than at a middle point of the film as a tone shifter. Now, I'm going to go ahead and talk about one other thing here. Myers wrote this script to be a grand tragedy. He took so much inspiration from great classical works and literary works, and most of the ancient Greek writings in general. In fact, he has a word here which I wrote down, and I'm probably going to pronounce wrong. Peripeteia. It's a Greek word, and it basically has to do with a hero being flawed and recognizing that they are wrong towards the end of the thing. There is a tremendous amount of elements of classic literary works in this film, all over the place. There's so many that, honestly, listing them all would get redundant. Not redundant, but just excessive. There would be so many. Lots of Greek inspiration. One of the interesting things, though, for me, is that while obviously Myers and Harve Bennett were both inspired by these literary allusions and works, they also worked to make it so that the characters, I should say, in the work were also similarly inspired, which adds another nice little layer to things. Instead of a character doing something which is an allegory for, Romeo and Juliet or whatever, the character in the piece is doing something because they, the character, are inspired by Romeo and Juliet. It's just a little bit different, but it's a nice little layer there. Most notably, Khan himself is one of the best examples of these. Remember, this man has been marooned for 15 years with nothing but his books to read over and over and over, but I'll talk more about that later. We're getting ahead of ourselves. Myers is an amazing director. Seriously. He is one of the best directors I've ever seen, and I say that without hesitation. The man has a really, really detail-oriented mind, and he really is good at visual storytelling. I'm going to put a couple of notes I wrote down here. First of all, he insisted that every action scene had lots and lots of movement happening in it. The actual characters moving about, doing this kind of thing, people in the background preparing stuff, people running around giving reports, all that kind of stuff. Lots of movement to make it so that, again, it's that visual storytelling. So you see there's lots of action on scene. And I mentioned this. I mentioned this because while I enjoy a nice space battle action scene as much as the next guy or girl, and I do a lot, actually, I love a really good space battle, it's worth noting that all of the tension and drama and excitement of an exciting space battle got across in this movie despite the fact that if you really look at it, the actual space battle scenes are almost non-existent. And of course they are. Remember, they had almost no budget here. They had so little that they could actually work with. So they couldn't, literally, could not actually have the epic space battles 2 that they actually wanted. So they showed tiny bits and pieces of it, and then they showed what's happening on the ship. Keep that energy going, keep the movement going, keep the flow of the action still active. So great job on that. Tons of little details in the background. Again, I'm going to try not to list too many of them, and indeed I stopped listing them after the 9-minute and 51-second mark. But look in the background of this movie sometime. Just watch all the little things. It's everywhere. Again, visual storytelling. He's really good with perspective shots. Meyer is very talented. If you've seen some of the sets for this movie, it's hilarious, because he is really good with getting very specific perspective and angle shots to make sets look much bigger and more expansive than they are. He was dealing with very small sets. Again, because of the budget problem. So this is again showing that wonderful talent and being able to take what is effectively a disadvantage and turning it into an advantage. He also had a huge insistence on thematic significance in the way things were approached. I'll be talking about a few examples of these later, but the very design of the Reliant is a good example. Again, I'll cover that in a moment. And then, of course, he himself went in and designed a lot of things specifically for this. For example, the naval significance, the uniforms, all the rank insignia, that was Nicholas Meyer, you know, stuff like that. Again, so huge props to the man. Another interesting point about Industrial Light and Magic, if I may. At this point in time when they were working on this film, Industrial Light and Magic had basically just come fresh off of Empire Strikes Back, which was arguably ILM's first real film. Yes, I know they worked on Star Wars and were basically founded during Star Wars, but when they were unleashed on Empire Strikes Back, and it showed. Empire Strikes Back had amazing visuals and designs, and again, has aged very well even to this day. So they were fresh off of that and already doing some of the prep work for Return of the Jedi, which at the time was called Revenge of the Jedi. I'm not going to tell the anecdote about that one. So as they're prepping for this, they were called over by Paramount and said, we want you to do work on this. Here's our budget range, blah, blah, blah. Honestly, it's debatable that this was basically when ILM was at their peak. Arguable, because they still did great stuff after this. But my point is, you have people who have great experience and great talent and great passion who have literally just come off of one of the best successes they will probably have ever had in their entire career. And you're told, here, go make this movie. Is it any wonder Star Trek II looks amazing even to this day? What's this say? Huh? Oh, yeah. This is another little anecdote. Did you know certain... this is just a wonderful commentary on the difference in times. 2 scenes were actually cut from this for the theatrical release in the United Kingdom. Why? Because it was going to get them an A rating or an AA rating. I forget which one is worse. And they wanted to get the one that was less worse. So they actually cut 2 scenes, both of which had to do with the brain eels. The... shoot, I can't remember what they're called. The eels. The brain slugs. And I just find that interesting because it's again a sign of how different our perspectives have become over the last years. And indeed, this was only 30 plus years ago. Only, listen to me. So Ricardo Montalban, I'm going to be talking about him in detail more in a bit, but I want to mention 2 things about the actor. First of all, he was actually reluctant to come into this piece at first. It was only until it was mentioned that he had a major role in the film, and the film was effectively going to be about him as the villain in many ways, that he decided to go ahead and accept it. That may sound a little egotistical, but it's worth noting this man had a very good career at the time, and was basically, he'd just come off of 6 years of some show. I forget what the name of the show was off the top of my head, but he was a mainliner at this point in time, so he was fully within his rights to expect something big for his role. I'm glad that he decided to it because Montalban is amazing in this film. But that brings me to my second point, and one of the reasons why I think he is so amazing. When he read the script, he felt that Khan was a type of villain who should be, in his words, a proper villain. In other words, a villain who does not realize or think that he is villainous. That from the perspective of the villain, he's not the bad guy. Now, that could be said of many villains across all of fiction, but you'd be surprised how few actors tend to portray it in that way. So he actually really put a nice little layer of subtlety to the performance for that. But again, I'll talk about that later. Final note here. Final couple of notes when it comes to... Okay, never mind. I have more behind-the-scenes notes. Apparently I'm stupid. There was a no smoking sign in this movie. I'm not kidding. There really is. Fun factoid. That sign was actually removed at the adamant insistence of Gene Roddenberry. This is the second change that Roddenberry actually had on this film. He literally refused to allow that to be written. He threw a fit about it from all intents and purposes. I shouldn't say a fit. He actually argued and yelled over this. He got upset over this. So again, I don't want to sound like I'm talking bad about him, because I am not. Because I actually get his point. Whether you are a smoker or not is something that is not my opinion, or excuse me, not my business, and therefore I have no opinion on it. But I mention it because Roddenberry was adamant that in the future we would have overcome such things as vices like that. Things that we do that we know are bad for us because we feel the benefits outweigh the detriments, or because we are chemically addicted, you know, whatever your reason is. And so he looked at that situation and said, no, get rid of that sign. And so he actually got the sign removed. It's only visible in the early part of the film. In all other scenes, it's actually absent because he insisted on it not being there. Just a little insight into the mind of Gene Roddenberry. Again, for good or for bad, I'll let you make up your own decisions on that one. The music for this film was done by James Horner. Does that name sound familiar? It should. This was, I believe, his second film ever, but either way, this was only 3 years after his first film ever. This was one of his very first films he'd ever done a score for, in other words. And he would go on to do the score of many, many other memorable films and memorable scores. Willow is one that actually comes to mind immediately, as weird as that sounds. But he did some really good stuff after this, so interesting thought process there. Kirstie Alley plays the Vulcan Saavik in this. She is one of 3 people who will be playing that role. If you don't know what I mean, you will by the time we get to the 6th video here. Kirstie Alley was basically considered perfect for the role. And Meyer basically said that she didn't even need to get into character because she already was in character. See, Kirstie Alley had a form of hero worship when she was younger over Spock. And so she thought the Spock character was great, and the opportunity to play a Vulcan was something she leapt at the chance to. And I do have to say, Kirstie Alley does a very good, very solid portrayal of a Vulcan in this episode, or this movie, excuse me. Because, much better than the portrayal that happens in the next film, if I could be so bold. Because, well, the woman who plays it in the next film, at least from memory, I haven't watched Star Trek 3 yet as of time of recording this, portrays her more as a stalwart, you know, Vulcan, as most people tend to portray Vulcans, which is basically flat or boring, in her case, flat, whereas Saavik added the fact that she was a Vulcan to it. She was willing to show emotion, she was willing to show her moral and ethical implications, you know. She was willing to be more than just a cardboard tube, and I liked that, but that is, of course, just my perspective on it. She also shows someone who is acclimated to human customs, I feel, based on a lot of the things she does throughout the course of this film. What else we got here? God, I love the visual elements of this film. I really do. Tiny little details are everywhere. And again, here's one of them. When they order raising the shields, the camera pans over for literally a couple of seconds to show the shield graphic. Why? Visual storytelling. So you know that's what that means. So you know exactly what the shield's raising means. And it's in the mind of the viewer without even having to further consider it. I mentioned back in my Star Trek 1 video that I wanted to be honest, basically. You know, I talked about how it is my nature to be more positive in general. It is my inclination to be more positive. It actually bothers me to be so negative about some things, and I try to be humorous when I'm being negative in order to add positivity to it, because it's just my nature. It is me. That is the real me, as someone who is a very positive individual, which is hilarious given how many depression issues I have. And so when I'm looking at a work, it is my tendency to kind of glance over the negative aspects of it, but I feel that's doing it a disservice, especially in a case like this. One of the things I have always said is that everything, even the truly great works, are flawed. We enjoy them because of or in spite of those flaws, not because those works are perfect. Saying that a work is perfect tends to lean too much into fanboyism, in my opinion. Whereas, for example, if I was a fanboy of Star Trek II, if someone criticized this movie, and I attacked them for criticizing something I loved, verbally attacked, obviously, although this can lead into physical violence as well, that would qualify me as a fanboy. Which I am not, and I don't actually want to be. That sounds like a horrible thing to me, which is one of the reasons I've always said both fanboys and hate boys need to go away. Hate boy is the exact same thing in reverse, by the way. For example, I hate this, and if you disagree with me, then I will attack you verbally or physically on a result of that. You know, you love it, but I hate it, therefore you're wrong. Kind of a mentality. But because I want to be fair and balanced, I want to point out the flaws in this movie, because there are flaws in this movie. Most of them are continuity or logical snarls that were more or less deliberately put in because it was felt like it wasn't necessary to really hammer them out. Meyer himself has gone on record as saying that he does not feel like continuity is a huge deal as long as a good story is being told. which of course makes a lot of sense for someone in his perspective, and indeed is actually true depending on your perspective. Moving on. Why is the neutral zone a bubble? This has bothered me even since I first saw this film when I was a kid. Why is the neutral zone a little bubble graphic? I've heard people bend over backwards trying to explain this, but seriously, there's this one little graphic, and it's just, first of all, it's a bubble, which makes the opposite of sense, because a neutral zone is the kind of thing that's like a space that you're not supposed to enter between two other spaces. So the only way that would make sense is if the Klingon space is this dinky little bubble inside that, which admittedly the thought of that amuses me. But that brings me to the second thing. It's not just a bubble, it's an incredibly minuscule bubble. Even if the Enterprise during the simulation is running at warp, which, okay, I'll grant it, we're talking a kind of bubble that's like the size of a system, if not smaller. That's just always bugged me, and I just felt like pointing it out. So, then Spock dies as part of the training simulation. Let me explain what I mean by this for a little moment, because some of you may not fully get the point here, okay? Remember how I talked back in December or whenever it was about The Empire Strikes Back? About how the big scene of Darth Vader was such a moment in theatrical history, and it actually changed the way theater and movies would work literally until this day. That effect is still being felt to this day in filmmaking. From, no, Luke, I am your father. That whole scene has had such an impact, right? And I spent so much time explaining it because it's hard to understand from the modern perspective. And I know a lot of my viewers were not around when that time came out. And again, no judgment. But that's why I'm trying to explain this to you. Again, a major character in an ongoing franchise dying in a major feature film was a huge deal. So Spock dying right at the beginning did something wonderful and amazing. It actually diffused the issue entirely. Because remember, no internet, right? No mass information network. News reports, interviews, newspapers, magazines, and letters, and the occasional phone call, a lot of which is rumor mongering and fifth or 12th person information, right? So in other words, all of us had heard that Spock dies in this movie. But then Spock dies in the first 10 minutes of the film, and then gets back up because it's a training simulation. So the logical reason, and everyone else assumed this, and this was done on purpose to engender this reaction, everyone assumed that Spock died on that. Someone who leaked the rumor misinterpreted it, and then leaked it out of outrage because, no, Spock can't die. And all of us were like, oh, okay. It was the perfect disarmament thing. I mention this because I know people who've rewatched this film who didn't even catch that, who didn't even understand why that, the Spock's death scene was even there in the beginning of the film, because it seems so nonsensical from the modern perspective. But at the time, it was perfect, because now none of us were expecting it when it actually happened. And it made the impact all the more, because all of a sudden we were caught by surprise. We're like, and even better than that, though, even better than catching us completely by surprise, it didn't even just have shock value. The moment we saw Spock go into that radiation room, we were like, oh no. Because then we knew. And it was powerful as a result of that. So that was brilliant work on behalf of the people who worked on this. The first shot of Kirk was one they actually reshot several times, believe it or not. Meyer was adamant that Kirk should literally look as if some great Greek deity had descended from on high to speak amongst them, because he wanted to get across that feeling of the legend that he felt was there. I mentioned before that he was not a Star Trek fan, but Meyer and Bennett both rewatched all the original series back to back, all the whole thing, to really get a feel and flavor for the show. And so he wanted to get across the legend that was James Tiberius Kirk, and so, dong, it's a great shot, and I just felt like mentioning it because they had to do some interesting lighting work to make that happen at all. So, here we are, finally, 9:21 mark, and I mentioned this whole thing where okay, first of all, there is wonderful humanity and subtlety in everyone's performances across the entire work. I want to mention the way that Bones talks to Kirk, and then Kirk snaps back at him quietly. I wouldn't even call it snapping, but what he is snapping. It just doesn't look like it, which then has Bones get an expression, not just because he's hurt, because he realized something's up with his friend. Tiny little details, right? Next thing that happens is Kirk grabs the book and actually looks away from it because his eyesight's bad, you know, like this kind of a thing. Because he's, I guess that would be farsighted. I'm not sure which. But anyway, so he's doing that. And then he talks to Spock and he says, "Is there a hidden message here, Spock?" And Spock says, "None that I'm aware, other than happy birthday." Which is beautifully ironic because Spock actually did have a hidden meaning in giving him that book. Although it wasn't at the beginning of the book, it was at the end of it. And the overall point here is that there are tiny, tiny details and nuances everywhere. And unlike in Star Trek the Motion Picture, I'm not going to detail them. And that's my note right here. I'm going to stop tracking all the little details except for the big ones, if that makes any sense. Let's talk about what midlife crisis means. Nowadays, that term has become synonymous with, "I'm going to go date a girl younger than I am and go get a car," which is funny because that, for some reason, midlife crisis automatically applies to guys for some reason. I've seen plenty of women go through midlife crises. But let's talk about what a midlife crisis is, where that term originally came from. The word crisis and midlife. I mention this because I felt like a real midlife crisis is a more serious thing than most people tend to take it for, and isn't something that should be taken as a joking matter. It is someone who literally feels like there is something wrong with their life and wants to fix that. The midlife crisis aspect of this episode, God, I keep saying that. It's the uniform. I'm wearing my Star Trek Voyager thing. It's because this is a Star Trek rumination. The aspect of that with regards to Kirk's character arc is adamant and on display. This is someone who has resigned himself to being behind a book, behind a desk. This is... I don't want to lose my train of thought, but I got to remember this. Okay, so I'm going to put this here to remind myself. This is someone who has basically moved past where he feels comfortable and best. In Spock's own words, his first best destiny. And he has no real understanding of his own place in the world or in life in general. And he feels like he's just sagging and falling into it. And that's why he's, and in Bones' words, approaching his birthday like it's his funeral. Let's go ahead and talk about this really quick. Star Trek the Motion Picture is never mentioned again in canon ever. Now that's not that unusual, but it's worth noting that Star Trek 2, 3, and 4 form a direct trilogy, and Star Trek 6 flows naturally from that trilogy. You could argue that 2, 3, 4, and 6 form one cohesive story. I would argue that, actually. In fact, when most people first get into Star Trek, I say, okay, you want to get into the movies? Watch 2, 3, 4, and 6 in that order, because it's all one complete character arc, right? Now, as I mentioned back in the motion picture, there are elements of both Spock and Kirk's character arcs that start in motion picture, and there are some good character moments. But in terms of actual impact and story arcs, it might as well not have even existed. Now, there's a line that Spock gives later, which basically contradicts the fact that motion picture exists. It is one line, it is a throwaway line. And as I mentioned, Meyer does not care that much about continuity, but a lot of fans have latched onto that to say that motion picture is not actually canon. Whether it is or not is, of course, up to your personal interpretation. You may feel free to think on this as you will. I mention it, though, because it's debatable in my mind whether or not it being canon or not makes the difference. At the end of motion picture, Kirk was, in command of the Enterprise, yes, but he was still the Admiral. At the end of that mission, it is very likely he would be called back to Starfleet to resume his duties as Admiral. And having had that taste of being in the command chair again, would it not be more logical for his character arc to fully thresh out into that abandonment? Because in Star Trek motion picture, he was hungry for the command chair. He shoved it down the CNC's throat, right? Now in Star Trek 2, he is reluctant to take it again because he has resigned himself to his fate, because he tasted it, and then he had to go back to real life, his own duties and all that fun stuff, right? As he himself puts it in this movie. So I would argue that leaving motion picture in canon actually makes it stronger, because it shows, again, that development of Kirk's character arc. By contrast, however, if you remove it from his character arc, it doesn't really detract from this overall character arc in general, because what we then have is Kirk comes back from his year mission, accepts promotion rather than having it forced on him like it was in motion picture, or at least it was implied in motion picture, accepts his promotion, and then, without that additional step, basically resigns himself to his new duties and his new position, his new status as an admiral, contenting himself with the fact that he can, in fact, do what he can, something here. But more importantly, one of the biggest themes of this movie comes forward in this particular aspect of the character arc, and that is age. That he now feels old. That he now feels like he can't do good anymore. He can't do his old job anymore. He can't be what he was. And he might as well accept that and move on. That form of negative acceptance is difficult to describe to someone who doesn't really experience it themselves. It's the idea of something is, when you tell yourself something is bad, and you acknowledge that it's bad, and you hate it, but rather than trying to change it, or grow to accept it, you just kind of grow to tolerate it. Grow to resent it, and tolerate it, and deal with it. And that's the position I feel Kirk is in this movie. Just kind of tolerating the fact that he is old. Tolerating the fact that he is an admiral now, instead of a captain. Bones has a wonderful, wonderful line in Kirk's quarters. He says, get your ship, get your command, before you really do grow old. I love that line because it is wonderfully subtle in its own quiet way. Before you really do grow old. The statement there being that Kirk is not old. He may be older, but he is not old. He is not decrepit. He is not an antique. He is not a relic. He can still do something. This quiet little theme is actually something that I enjoy most about an episode, I forget the name of it, forgive me, in TNG. Relics, I believe, is the name of the episode, where Montgomery Scott is in that one. It's a great episode, by the way. And it's also the underlying theme of that whole episode, which in many ways was inspired by some of the elements of Star Trek II, which is why I mentioned it here. Nice comments about the Miranda class. For those of you who don't know what that is, the Miranda class starship is the Reliant. That is what the class of starship is. It's a brilliant design. And again, huge props to Michael Miner. He does so much good work in this movie. The Miranda class is designed... Well, okay, first of all, it was designed because they were tired of working on the Constitution model. The Constitution model was a huge, colossal pain to work with, so they wanted something a little bit simpler, a little bit more truncated, and a lot easier to maneuver around. And cheaper, because again, budget. So they turned the Constitution into the Reliant, but when he did so, rather than just mashing it together, he bothered to make it a very specific design setup, so that depending on the angle you look at the ship, it either looks majestic, you know, very Federation style, or with slightly different lighting and a different angle, it looks a lot more like a destroyer. And you can understand why that's so important, why the Reliant can actually look menacing and deadly in certain scenes. I love that the subtlety of the design for it. I just want to give general praise for Paul Winfield, because he's awesome. He is the gentleman who plays Commander Terrell, Captain Terrell in this movie. He does an amazing job of it, as he always does. Paul Winfield has always been a great actor, and he also is really good in what is often considered among the best TNG episodes of all time, the Darmok episode. He actually played the captain, the alien captain. But he does a wonderfully amazing performance in this one of someone who is... Well, let me put it to you this way. I've often felt that too often there are two types of captains that are portrayed in Star Trek. This is true in original series and TNG, and in some cases in DS9 and Voyager, and definitely in Enterprise as well. In order to highlight how the positive traits of the main captain, you know, Kirk, Picard, Sisko, etc., right? They make the guest star captains one of two things: an idiot or overconfident. And they usually go into extremes in this. So most of the times, again, there are exceptions, but most of the times we see a guest star captain. That captain is someone who is basically designed to be, and you just don't really... And the actors in general tend to portray them with that sort of thing. You know, they go too far to an extreme. It basically becomes a caricature. I can understand why. They're only given one character trait to work with, so I can see how they do that. But I give credit to Paul Winfield for playing the character like a captain. I could actually see this man being a captain, being a competent, good captain. Someone who actually, I mean, even while he's under the mind control in later scenes, you can kind of see the fact that he still feels and still cares about some of the things he's being forced to do. He is still disturbed by the crew of the... or the crew, I shouldn't say, the scientists of Regula 1 being tortured and all this horrible stuff, and all the people who have been dead, and the people who have been abandoned. Marooned, there we go, that's the word, marooned on Ceti Alpha 5, you know, it bothers him. So he portrays a decent, good captain who also has aspects of quality to him, you know, competency, that kind of a thing. So just huge, huge props to Paul Winfield for really selling that role. We're off our first page, guys. Woohoo! Actually, before we leave the first page, I want to mention something here. Normally I talk about themes last, but it was actually one of the first notes I had, and I kind of skipped over it. Meyer himself has actually done a whole interview talking about the themes of this work. And so I'm just going to jot over this really quickly, but the themes of this work, and there are several. Okay, let me rewind a little bit. Most of the time, I've talked about, especially in gaming, how there's an obvious theme and a hidden theme. The obvious theme is the one that's right on display. The hidden theme is the one you're supposed to think about after you finish playing the game, after you finished watching the movie, whatever like that. So, but most often the formula is two themes. And the reason why is if you're going to have any more than one theme in your fictional work, it's commonly considered good writing practice to have them link together, right? To have those themes flow together and be a part of each other so it forms a more cohesive whole. Make sense? So it's easier to do two themes that do that than 8 or 12. It has been argued by one of my viewers, you know which one you are, that Into Darkness had like way too many themes and they didn't have anything to do with each other, and that's one of the reasons why that movie had so many problems. One of many reasons, I might add. But in this case, we have 4 themes, and all of them flow together surprisingly well. The first is the one I've already covered at some length, aging. The effects of age on us, the effects of getting older, and all the things that are both positive and negative about that. We have wisdom and experience, we also have decay and rot, we have lack of energy, but we also have greater foresight, that kind of a thing. We also tend to make more mistakes because we are more human, we are more flawed. But we also have the ability to recover from those mistakes better because we have that experience of what a mistake feels like, right? A great example of this is actually much later when Spock points out that Khan, for all his skill and intellect, has very little experience. And that's one of the reasons why Kirk is able to match him on several occasions despite effectively being the inferior human, because he has that age thing going for him. You follow? And of course, the age theme is everywhere in this entire film. So, second point. Death. This one's also quite obvious. The theme of death is arguably considered the theme of Star Trek II, especially because it is so understated in the fact that, yes, lots of people die, but overall the theme of death does not necessarily have to do with dying, but rather the effects of death, the after effects of death, the lead up towards death, the fear of death, the consequences, you know, all of these aspects of what death really means to a person and to people are throughout the entire course of this work, leading up to and, of course, including the finale and the climax with Spock's death. The next one is the no-win scenario, which is a huge and adamant theme of this film. I'll be talking more about the no-win scenario much, much later. On page 3, I want to say, of my notes. I mention it here, though, because the entire point is dealing with a no-win scenario is something that some people have to deal with in their lives. And how we deal with that, in my opinion, and I agree with what Kirk says in this film, does say a lot about who and what we are, really. Kirk actually has a wonderful quote, how we deal with death is at least as important as how we deal with life. And therefore, again, ties death into the theme of the no-win scenario, which also ties age into it, because Kirk certainly didn't think that way when he was younger. And indeed, the younger Saavik, God, you know, Christy Alley, does not quite get that, does not actually have that age or experience. So that's how all 3 themes there have tied in one nice little nutshell. But that brings me to my last theme. Now, Meyer himself said vengeance was the last theme, but upon reflection, I feel he is actually underselling himself. Vengeance is definitely a major aspect of this story, but only when it comes to Khan, really. In every other aspect, vengeance doesn't really touch the actions of anybody else. But one thing does, and one thing does help tie in all the other themes throughout all the other major characters, and it still ties in with vengeance. Obsession. Kirk, his obsession has already been expressed, and it is expressed rather strongly, of course in the motion picture, but it's even expressed here. His desire to command the Enterprise, to be a captain, the captain again. But we see several other aspects of obsession throughout the course of the work. Saavik's obsession with trying to equal up to and impress Spock throughout the course of this, which will actually kind of play through in Star Trek VI. I know, it's weird. We'll get there. Khan's obsession is, of course, incredibly obvious. But there's also the obsession of both of the Marcuses, which is also going to be touched on in Star Trek 3. Their obsession and desire to make this wonderful, amazing thing to help the galaxy on a grand and cosmotic scale. Cosmotic? Cosmic scale. Nah. You know. And then there's Spock's own obsession with not only keeping himself quiet and preserved, but in turn, well, not to put too fine a point on it, but Spock's obsession has always been to serve others. Logically, yes, but with moral and ethical implications throughout. It's also one of the reasons I find his reaction to the Genesis device interesting, but I digress. Point is, it's a theme I feel flows through the whole piece much more so than Vengeance does. Just my take on it. So, now we'll move on to our second page. Okay, so I do like one thing about this film much, much more than Star Trek the Motion Picture. Just the one thing. Otherwise, Motion Picture is a superior film in every way. I'm sorry, I can't even say that. I obviously think Star Trek 2 is better. No offense, though. If anybody out there likes Star Trek Motion Picture, hey, I asked you last time to tell me why. One thing I do like, though, is that the secondary guest stars feels like they get more attention overall. Sulu doesn't have that much to do. Uhura has a few additional scenes. Scotty has some much more significant aspect on in this film. But the one that really shines for me is Chekhov. And I like this because Chekhov was, how do I put this? Practically irrelevant in almost every aspect of motion picture. You could have rewritten him as an extra and you wouldn't have noticed. And I feel that's doing a disservice because, A, Walter Koenig is actually a really good actor. If you don't believe me, go watch Babylon 5 sometime. Seriously, go watch it. It's a great show. But he has done some other really good stuff here and there. And he actually really knows how to put out a good performance when he tries. And I feel like that really gets through in this movie, too, because he gets a lot more screen time, and they actually do some good stuff with him. I also feel like he fits rather smoothly into the position of commander. I've always thought that Chekhov, would be the kind of character who would fit naturally into the command track. And I say that because not every character is like that. Most characters I can't see really segueing into the command track and becoming officer material. And actually going to the point where they become a captain or admiral. As we know from history, he did actually become Admiral Chekhov in the end, so props there. But for example, McCoy, no, he'd always be stuck in medical. Sulu definitely, yes, but I don't think Uhura could ever bring herself to go into command light. Probably, maybe something more diplomatic, into the diplomatic corps, or really going into the Federation as a whole rather than Starfleet, that kind of a thing, right? And Scotty, I could never see going to the officer track as well. And I could talk about this with regards to TNG as well. For example, I think that Worf going into the command track was a natural move, whereas Data should not go into the command track because it's contrary to his character arc. If you follow where I'm going with here, right? I mention this because this is Chekhov's first step into that command track, which unfortunately will not really be fleshed out too much past this point. But I do like it in here, and I do like the fact that he has more to do on screen time. And he does some good stuff with it. One nice little tidbit. I know, I said I wouldn't talk about all the little details. Carol refers to Kirk as Jim Kirk. That's a wonderfully subtle detail, and a lot of people didn't catch that first viewing, including myself, because it espies a ton of... I'm losing my words. It speaks to the familiarity she already has with him. Now, obviously, we know that now, but at the time, this is just some random woman who apparently happens to know James T. Kirk personally, and on such a personal basis that she is comfortable with calling him Jim. How many other people call him Jim? Let's see, Bones, Spock. I'm not actually sure there are any others. So, that kind of says something right there. Nice little touch. So, why do the scanners pick up the eel but not the people on Ceti Alpha 5? That's always bugged me. They detect the life form on the planet, and they're not even sure if it is a life form. Now, obviously, scanners are not going to work that well with it, but they go down and they find an eel, and completely miss the 20-some supermen who are over there. It's like, what? That always bugged me, but there's something that always bugged me more. Ceti Alpha 6 exploded 6 months after we were left here. Do planets just explode randomly? I mean, okay, a lot of things bug me about this. First point, and again, I said I'm going to be on balance. I'm going to be honest. So this is a plot point that is literally required for the movie to progress, but bugs the crap out of me. Why do planets just randomly explode? I can't actually think of any other example of that off the top of my head where there wasn't some kind of nefarious point to it. So, okay, whatever, fine. We'll just accept it. Ceti Alpha 6 explodes. I do like that it sent Ceti Alpha 5 out of its orbit. It would. I do like the impact it has on the world, because it would. I mean, all of that makes perfect sense, right? I'm with that so far. Second point. Why does nobody at Starfleet recognize that Ceti Alpha 6 has exploded? In the last 15 years, I might add. Did no one ever come here to check up on this system, which is in Starfleet territory, given its proximity to Regula and Earth in general? This is definitely in Starfleet territory, so why did nobody ever discover that a freaking planet exploded in a system in their territory? Okay, so that's the second point. Third point. Why does the Reliant not realize that there's one too few giant orbs of rock and matter out there than should be? Why does nobody at any point recognize that the planet they're looking at, which they think is Ceti Alpha 6, is A, out of orbit, B, not looking anything like it should, and C, where's the other planet in the system? That's it. That's all I got. I just wanted to time it, because it bugs the crap out of me. That being said, it can and has been explained away in some of the literary works. I just mentioned this because one of the things I've always felt in a good work or a bad work, with regards to my own personal opinion, is that the niggling details, the extent to which they bother me, tends to depend on the overall quality of the rest of the work. For example, someone actually bashed me for being really excessively negative during my lore run of Mass Effect 3. In response to that, my reasoning for that, and I doubt you're even watching this if you're the commentator, but in response to that, Mass Effect 3 overall was such a negative game for me that the little details bothered me more than they otherwise would. And so I kept harping on them because it was getting to me. Like, that was my honest reaction. In other words, I was already in the negatives, and the other negatives pushed me further into the negatives. For a more positive work, like Mass Effect 2, to use a direct example, it certainly has all these issues and problems and flaws with it, but I don't mind them because the overall effect of the work elevates the work to the point where I look at the thing and I'm like, huh? And then I move on. Like with Star Trek 2. For example, they missed a planet. Huh? And then I move on, because they do something good with it and the rest of the work is positive, in my opinion. Does that make sense? I already mentioned the book thing, but I'm going to mention it again here. They actually have several books. Dante's Inferno, Paradise Lost, Statute Regulating, Moby Dick, and King Lear, and the King James Bible, I believe, are the books that they showed on the thing. That's from memory. Forgive me if that's incorrect. But I know the big ones there are King Lear, Paradise Lost, and Moby Dick. Three of the things that are used as in-character literary impetuses, I guess, for like obsessions for Khan himself. Because remember, Khan has had almost nothing to do in the last 15 years except read his books, try to survive, and watch his people die one by one. I mention this especially because this is actually a very important point. Because you have to realize, this is the difference between writing something and using a literary inspiration as a writer, and then using a literary inspiration as a writer for a character. In Meyer's own words, Khan is someone who has read these books so many times, especially with his kind of memory, that he literally can quote them word for word, that almost every line that comes out of his lips is going to be parroted from one of those books, not because Meyer, the writer, is parroting those books, but because Khan is. But because they are so ingrained into his subconscious and his forethought of his minds, that he probably doesn't even notice that he's parroting these books at this point in time. That he just is quoting them practically verbatim because it has had such an indelible effect on him, because of his fixation on them, because of his obsession with them, which I'll talk about another point in a moment. Speaking of Khan, Ricardo Montalban's performance, again, amazing. He does three great things with it, though. Number one, he manages to come across as wonderfully manic. In the novelization of this movie, there's actually a scene where he literally goes into a rage, just a violent rage, and beats several of the crew of the Reliant to death. I think that scene actually fits very well with the character of Khan at this point in time. Someone who has gone so far past the brink, someone who has survived all this crap, and is, again, absolutely obsessed. Which brings me to my next point. He adds a great deal of weight and severity to his performance. Montalban himself actually mentioned how he was worried that his performance would be mocked for the way he was performing it. Maybe people have mocked him for this. for his performance. I mean, there's parodies, but I've never actually heard anyone mock his actual performance of Khan, because in my opinion, and the opinion of many others I've talked to this about, he adds so much gravity to the way he speaks and how he speaks. You can tell this is a man who is already broken, someone who is effectively already just a shell of a man, and will also serve as a wonderful counterpoint to the Star Trek 3 that never was. Try to keep that in the back of your minds for the next episode when I talk about Star Trek 3. Khan is someone who lost everything, and what was left was a broken husk that just wanted to hurt people. Keep that in the back of your mind, okay? The expression on his face, though, when he learns that Kirk has become an admiral is wonderful. At first he just looks, Admiral. Admiral. And it just sinks in with him. Why? I've talked about this before, I forget where. But speaking personally, I know exactly what it feels like. So I'm going to use a fictional example rather than a real example. Let's say something happens to you. Doesn't matter what. Circumstances don't matter. Something happens to you. You have something bad happen to you. You go off, and all you can think about is, like, someone you care about, for example. That's all that's keeping you going. Because you are in horrible, trying times. When did I talk about this? You are in horrible, trying times, and you are hurt and bruised and weakened, and the thoughts of that person help sustain you, right? It might not even be a person. It could be like a thing or a book or whatever. But let's say a person, and it's like, oh my God, and you're just barely holding on, and it gets to the point where, especially over long periods of time, months or years, God forbid, you get to the point where you basically have put that person on a pedestal, whether you wanted to or not, because they are the only thing that has been a positive in a massive sea of negative for you. So you have naturally perceived them through this lens of, this is the only thing keeping me going. And then you get out. You go back. You fix things. You're healed. You're no longer in the hospital, whatever. And you get out and you find out that that person barely even acknowledges that you exist. Didn't think about you at all. Because for them, it was a Tuesday. You see the difference here? You went through all this horrible, terrible stuff and clung to those thoughts and memories. They lived an ordinary life. And maybe thought about you every now and again, but that was it. Khan has thought about Kirk constantly. As everything has gone to hell, as his wife died, as his people died, as he suffered, as he had nothing to do, no power, nothing. The one thing that was there in the back of his mind was Kirk. Just like happened with Ahab, actually. Whereas Kirk, who went on to live, well, not a normal life, but for him a normal life, why would he ever think of Khan? Why would it ever occur to him? It has been noted by some Star Trek fans that Kirk should have come and checked up on Khan, and didn't, for 15 years. Probably because it never occurred to him to. He is, after all, a very flawed human individual. If I can diverge for just a moment, though. Oh, no, wait, hang on, I hadn't finished my point. The point is, though, when Khan says Admiral, the way he says that, it becomes obvious he is understood in one word. We see that Khan understands what that means. He has suffered and broken and bruised and lost. Kirk has received a promotion. In that one moment, his obsession just went into overdrive and will never actually recover from that up until his death. So, segue for a moment. I mentioned Moby Dick several times, or at least I meant to. I've actually read Moby Dick more than once. It's a book that I enjoy more than I should. And I say that because the actual subject material of, you know, whale anatomy and life on a ship and that kind of thing is certainly not the most interesting thing in the world to me. But I love the way it is written, the literal structure of the word choice and the sentences and the way it flows with itself and the way that it actually approaches its very human characters. I like that. I often use Moby Dick as a way to see if someone else has interest in literary classics like that, because if I mention Moby Dick, virtually everyone in the United States knows what Moby Dick is, at least of a certain age. And most of them can say, oh, it's about revenge. And they are wrong, because Moby Dick is not actually about that, as anybody who's actually read the book can tell you. That is certainly an undercurrent and one of the many themes of the thing, but the thing is, Moby Dick is a huge book, which has a lot to do with things other than the great white whale, right? I mentioned this, though, because one of the things Moby Dick did very well is the progression of his obsession and fixation with revenge on the white whale was very natural. It wasn't like, because so many people look at it and say, oh, I hate that white whale. But it wasn't that way. It was the white whale caused this injury, the white whale caused this aspect, and then as a result of that, a few series of dominoes happened. And those dominoes in the mind of Ahab were then a consequence of what had happened initially. Therefore, forgive me for misquoting this, but the then... I can't do it. I don't know. But basically, the injury that is being suffered now was a direct consequence of what happened then. Okay, forgive me for totally misquoting that. The book is way more eloquent than I am. And that natural progression of things continued to go bad is exactly what happened to Khan, is what I'm trying to say here. In Moby Dick, something bad would happen and he would be reminded of the incident, and it would make him more fixated on it, more obsessed with the incident, more obsessed with the white whale, more obsessed with revenge. Khan would have something bad happen and would become more obsessed with his revenge against Kirk, and more obsessed with blaming Kirk for all that happened. Whether it was actually his fault or not is inconsequential, because it was another piece of the domino. You see how this works? That's another reason why I say that the Moby Dick thing was more of an inspiration for Khan than it was for Nicholas Meyer. Eels. Gross Ceti Alpha eels. They enter your brain and then they wrap around your part of your brain and they make you very suggestive. That's gross. However, I remember as a kid literally not being able to watch this scene. I literally would do this over the course of the scene, and then I would know, because of the audio, when the scene was over, and then I'd be like, okay. Because it bothered me so much. Now, obviously, I've become a little bit more exposed to horrible things since then, but I decided to go ahead and rewatch it in full, not flinch away or anything, just to see. And it is nowhere near as bad as it was. It's still incredibly creepy. But as I've discussed many times, the kind of horror that I tend to enjoy is the horror that is implied, not shown. Like I've said many times, I'm not a fan of gore, I'm not a fan of jump scares, I'm not a fan of big, gooshy violence scenes, right? The implication there, we don't see a lot of things. We just see the eel start to crawl up, go into the ear. We don't see a lot of things that they could actually have shown in that, and probably would have shown in a more modern film, and indeed technically did in the Abrams film. So I like the fact that they don't show as much, and therefore it doesn't bother me that much. It's still freaking horrifying, especially the implication that it will eventually drive you mad and kill you, but whatever. The art design is amazing. I actually have a note here that just says the art design and art direction is amazing. And again, lots of little touches. I'm only going to mention the one. Khan has a necklace from MacGyver still around his chest. No attention is ever paid to it. It's never brought up. No one ever points to it and says, what's that? It's just there. Visual storytelling, again. So I mentioned back in Motion Picture the whole military question when it comes to Star Trek, and how so many people have had different perspectives on this throughout the years. I have, of course, given mine. I will rehash it here in case you didn't watch my last episode. I think Starfleet's a military. Bam, done. That's my opinion, though, okay? And it is entirely valid that other people have differing opinions on the matter. As long as you're willing to at least acknowledge my opinion is valid, then I am totally willing to acknowledge yours is valid. If you're going to yell at me and call me an idiot, then get out of my show. I've had that happen to me before, by the way. I've actually had a Star Trek fan, one ever. I don't actually encounter that many obstinate or otherwise unpleasant Star Trek fans. Maybe I'm just lucky in that respect. But I did have one guy at convention once who literally got into a shouting argument with me about whether... I didn't shout back, he was shouting at me, about whether or not Starfleet was a military, and his friends who were there were telling him to chill out and cool down. And I finally was like... Because my whole point was, I'm willing to acknowledge that. I'm totally willing to see that if you're willing to discuss it, but you have to acknowledge my points about being a military. And he refused to. He literally refused to acknowledge my points and kept hammering me that it was not Roddenberry's vision and blah, 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 blah. Now, he gave me some of his points, but at no point in time was he willing to discuss it. So you see my point here. Or if you don't, feel free to yell and rant at me. Moving along. I mentioned the military question here because in Meyer's mind, keep in mind this is not a Star Trek fan, so take that as it's worth, but Nicholas Meyer's mind, he designed Starfleet in Star Trek II to be a navy, to be a military naval force. Period, end of discussion, okay? I'm not saying Starfleet's military. I'm saying that the reason why we get those uniforms I love so much, the way we have the rank insignia, that there's so much naval protocol in this film, and there's lots of it, is because he deliberately designed it to be such, okay? So, for anybody who's curious why this movie has so much more of a naval feel to it, especially with regards to how the ship functions, person giving an order to a person, giving an order to a person, that is that same naval feel, and that is exactly how it works on a ship if you've ever been on one. Speaking as someone with a bit of a naval military background in my family, I totally get that, and it's one of the reasons I think I've always had such a ship obsession, for lack of a better term. Moving on. Nice little subtle touch. Kirk, when he's doing his inspection, pulls out a little white cloth, wipes it on the thing, inspects it for dust, puts it away. No dialogue. I love the subtlety of this gesture, because Scotty's grinning the whole time. Why is he grinning? Is it because it's spotless? No, it's not because there's no dust. That gesture is exactly that. Kirk is showing through this gesture, without saying anything, how impressed he is by what engineering looks like and how good it looks and how in order everything appears. He is doing that to demonstrate, because he picks up that rag, and you could tell by the way he does it. He knows there's going to be no dust. He's not checking for dust. He is showing that there is no dust to demonstrate how impressed he is. I love the subtlety of that gesture. There's a lot of little stuff like that. Again, I'm only going to point out a few. I swear. Stop hitting me. The fun fact, the bridge in Star Trek II is actually, in just about every way, the same set they used in Star Trek I. I didn't know that until I was doing research for this film, for this episode you're watching right now. Really, I didn't. And I got to give huge props again to the art director and to Nicholas Meyer himself, because they did some wonderful stuff to redress it and make it look like a new set, when it isn't. It is the exact same set for motion picture. And you might be like, well, why is it the same set? Budget issues. So I'm just going to start saying that. Budget issues, because it's going to come up more. So they did a little different things with the lighting. They had a little bit of a grip hook, which had this light, which could come down on like a little chandelier kind of thing, so they could light the whole room and show the whole thing at the same time, which was something they couldn't do before. They had a lot of different things with regards to moving a couple of panels around and making the buttons look a little bit more polished, that kind of a thing. Really got away from that 70s pastel look and made it look more like the 80s hard red look, at least in my opinion. Good stuff, though. Definitely good stuff. So Spock's character arc is definitely continuing. Spock puts Saavik on the con, the command chair, for those who don't know what that means. In other words, in command of the ship, effectively. When they say you have the con, it means you are acting captain as of this moment, whether you're the actual captain or not. Why does he do that? I love this because this is a continuation of his arc, or the beginning of his arc, depending on if you decide that motion picture doesn't exist or not. Reason number one, it will help her. Saavik needs to, not sneeze, Saavik needs to see what it's like to actually be in the command chair. And keep in mind, she actually took the Kobayashi Maru earlier, and if you don't know what that means, basically only people who tend to take that are people who are on the command track, on the officer's line track, right? And so she is someone who obviously wants to accelerate to that point in her career. Giving her the con, probably for the first time, is a good step to that. And logging con hours is something you have to do in most navies, and this is true in Star Trek as well, in order to actually qualify for certain things. So that's nice. Second reason he does it, to poke fun at Kirk. Because he's putting... Kirk has been so clearly and obviously ill at ease, and Spock is intelligent enough and knows his best friend well enough to know why he's ill at ease. Because the Enterprise is being crewed by cadets. There's that age theme coming in again, by the way. Because, again, age does not just necessarily mean aging. Age means how it affects what we are and what we do. When we are young and inexperienced, we act differently than we are older and seasoned, right? At least I hope so. If we don't, then what the hell? What's the point of living at that point? But, so Kirk has obviously been incredibly ill at ease at the entire Enterprise being basically crewed by children, for all intents and purposes. And in fact, he actually says flat out, children at one point in time, and in some of the ancillary works, whether this is canon or not is debatable. Some of the ages of some of the crew are given. It's in the 14 to 20 year range. That's really young to be on the freaking flagship. If you'll forgive me for being blunt, it's really young to be on a ship in general, especially a whole cruiser like the Constitution class is. You should be on something a little bit smaller and a little bit less intensive. And in fact, this is actually shown to be true throughout the course of Star Trek. DS9 even touched on this issue later on. Point being, so that's the second reason. He knows Kirk is having some issues with regards to that, so he puts Saavik on there to poke fun at him in a light, friendly manner. But then there's the third reason, and I love this because this is so Spock. He puts Saavik on the con to show that it's going to be okay. He does this for Kirk's benefit, to show Kirk that, yes, these are cadets, yes, they're young, yes, they're inexperienced, but they've still got the skill and the knowledge. They could still do their jobs. Just give them a chance to do so. I love the subtlety of that gesture. So, question for you. Why does Chekhov hesitate at mentioning Kirk, but not the Genesis device when he's talking to Carol Marcus? I'll talk about Carol Marcus more later, by the way. I've got some things to say about her. Great portrayal by the actor as ever. So many good performances in this movie. I personally think this is distance theory coming into play again. Chekhov knows what Genesis can do, knows what would happen if Khan gets his hands on Genesis. It is an apocalyptic weapon, and I'll be talking more about Genesis itself later, by the way. So he understands how bad that is, but it's an intellectual thing. It's distanced. He doesn't actually feel that in person or up front or anything like that, if you follow the logic here. By contrast, he knows Kirk personally. He knows his face. He knows his friendship. It's much harder to betray a friend than it is to betray a name or a number or a concept. So I've always felt that this is a nice way of showing the friendship that Kirk has with Chekhov, despite the fact that Chekhov isn't even on the same ship with him anymore. And the friendship that should be there amongst the crew, which really comes forward again in 4 and in 6. But moving on. And in 3, excuse me, sorry. 3, 4, and 6. I don't know why I missed 3 on that one. Trust me, Chekhov's friendship and loyalty thing will come in a big way in 3. Carol. Oh, well, okay, so here we go. This is only a note about Carol. Carol Marcus is portrayed as someone who is very fiercely intelligent, very driven, very passionate. In many ways, effectively a female Kirk, just in a more scientific field rather than a command field, right? That was done very deliberately because the intent was Meyer wanted someone who could keep stride with Kirk. That was his own words. He wanted someone who could keep up with him, someone who would match him, be just as competent, just as capable, just as strong-willed, just as charismatic. And in every way she portrays this, she actually does take command in more than one ways in more than few scenes, and I like the way they do that. But I mention it here because I've always felt that the reason why that they were capable of keeping Genesis from Khan for so long was because she didn't just have a hunch that things were wrong. She knew things were wrong. Why? Remember that conversation she has with Kirk on the comm as she's calling him and saying, what are they taking? Why is Genesis? She has a specific line that's deliberately put in there. I can see you, but I can't hear you. Watch Kirk's expression and his gesticulating while they're talking. She could tell watching him that something is wrong. And that is what gave her the forewarning necessary to deal with the situation and to plan in order to get the Genesis device to safety, rather than just leaving it there. It is arguable that if not for the fact that Khan had a deadline to meet, a.k.a. going and blowing up the Enterprise, he would have found the transporter just the way the Kirk did. In fact, I'd say that's a guarantee. It's a bit of a shame because I have a feeling that the Carol and the others had an ambush planned for them, and then when nothing materialized, they assumed that they were not coming, and then kind of relaxed, and then the crew showed up, etc., etc. So it makes sense when you think about it. So, why is the Enterprise the only ship in the quadrant? I just mentioned this in the last movie. And this is going to come up again in future movies. Why is the Enterprise the only one in the quadrant? That's it. That's all I'm saying. That's all I'm putting out there. But keep in mind, the Enterprise launched from Earth Space Dock. And the Enterprise is the Enterprise. This is not 1701A or B or C or D or E. Okay? So their warp flight is a little bit slower than the others, which means they're relatively close to Earth, which means, again, there's no ships near Earth. Moving on. There are some amazing character pieces with Spock, and I only want to mention one here because Spock has a great scene where he insists that Kirk take command. And Kirk says, no, 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 no. And Spock says, Jim. The understanding and friendship between the two is amazing. Nimoy, I told you I'd mention this later, Nimoy himself said this scene, along with several other scenes, is basically what convinced him to give Star Trek another chance. The humanity of it, the emotion of it, the connection of it, the friendship of it was all there and on display, and he felt it really helped tie things together and push that feeling of what he had enjoyed about working on the original show back into his performance. And I think it's one of the reasons why Spock's performance is so much more human, for lack of a better term, so much more real, that's the word I'm going to use, than it was in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, where Nimoy himself was actually aggravated about being on the show, being on the movie. Whereas in this movie, by the time he actually started doing the scenes, he was actually getting into it again. He was getting into the feeling of it, the flow of it, rather than just doing a job. And I think that really affected his performance. It also kind of tied into something else I'll be talking about very much at the end, and I just forgot. Shoot, hang on, real quick. So yeah, I'll talk about that at the end, like I said. Joachim, which is a weird way to pronounce that, but that is how they pronounce it in the movie. Joachim is an interesting character. There was a bit of a behind-the-scenes snafu with his agent basically screwing things up and trying to get him better billing, which resulted him in basically not getting billed. The actor who played him, whose name I don't even know off the top of my head, actually didn't get credited for his role of Joachim, which is a shame because he's actually a fairly major secondary character in this piece. He is, I'm just going to say this, even though it's been commented on before, he is without question the Starbuck allegory. In other words, Starbuck from Moby Dick. Someone who is fiercely, zealously, dedicatedly loyal to the main character, in this case Khan, but is still willing to challenge him. In other words, he is actually the equivalent of what Bones was back in the motion picture for Kirk, the one who was close enough to him and loyal enough to him to point out when he was wrong. He is the one who sees past revenge and past all that stuff, despite having suffered in many ways as Khan has, because he wants to see Khan rise to greatness again. But Khan can't see that, and Khan's motivations are laid bare in that wonderful scene. Khan does not want to rise to power again. He might eventually. If he revenged himself on Kirk, he undoubtedly would try to reclaim power. But in that moment, all he could think about is that obsession, that fixation, that one thing that was on his mind for 15 years. It's all he could think about. Once that's settled, then I'll think about the future. Right now, this is all that matters. And as I mentioned in my earlier discussion, it's actually very understandable why he would be like that. So, then they go to the Genesis briefing over on the Enterprise. Why is Bones brought to that briefing? Well, there's an in-character and there's an out-of-character reason for that. The out-of-character reason is obvious. They wanted the differing perspectives on the Genesis device to highlight it for the audience, in case the audience really hadn't put two and two together. In other words, it's a wonderful thing that can be used to create life, and it's a horrible thing that can be used to destroy life. Bones also is invited to that meeting for one other very important reason, in character. It demonstrates exactly how much trust Kirk has in him. This is something that is top-level security, the kind of thing that Spock had never even heard of. Spock, a captain who already probably has ridiculously high security clearance, had never even heard of Genesis. Kirk had, because he was an admiral. In fact, I believe a more than just a base admiral. He was well up there in the echelon of Starfleet. So Kirk, at that point, trusts Bones enough to share this with him. And of course he does. It's Bones, McCoy, one of his best friends, if not tied for his best friend of all time. Of course he would share that with him. But that brings me to the Genesis device, finally. I said I'd talk about it when I got to it. This is the first time the Genesis device is actually explained, which I find funny because it's true, they never actually discussed what it is up until this scene, having rewatched this movie. I always forget that, obviously knowing what the Genesis device is on replays. Michael Miner came up with the Genesis device, and its inclusion is the perfect Tetris block for this situation. What we have here is a device that adds to the setting, adds to the plot, and adds to the themes beautifully. We have some. It actually adds characterization too for Carol and for David Marcus. This is a device that can terraform on a planetary scale, can completely turn a dead world into a living one, theoretically at least, and obviously flawed, as we find out in Star Trek 3, but moving along. This is something that can be used to help the Federation, and I just want to point this out. She actually has a line where she mentions food and population as galactic problems in Star Trek. Now again, Myers didn't really care about continuity that much, but this actually does fit surprisingly well into Star Trek continuity because A, this is before the golden era of Starfleet, of the Federation, which happens post Undiscovered Country, post Star Trek 6, and B, this is before replicators existed. In actual fact, the Genesis device is in many ways considered by some fans, including myself, to be effectively an early attempt at making replicator technology on an ambitious and grand scale, admittedly, but same concept: matter rearranged into other matter, which is basically what replication technology is, right? There are some inconsistencies with that. Yes, I know. Let's just not get into the nitty-gritty on that one, shall we? But the point here is that it helps flesh out the setting because it shows that this Starfleet is still struggling. This is still a period in which Starfleet is not the safe haven that it otherwise could be, that this is still, in some ways, the frontier. That this is the Great West, just like it was in the original series, right? And so we're still having problems with food. We're still having problems with population. We're still having problems with resources. That's still a concern for Starfleet. By the time TNG rolls around, those concerns have basically been flung out the window. Because we do have replicator technology. We do have the golden era of peace. We do have the cooperation with the other major nations, etc., right? I'll be discussing that more when we get to TNG. So it wonderfully adds and beautifully fits into the setting. But the next thing, I mentioned that this device is something that the peace-loving Federation, forgive me for quoting Sci-Fi Debris, would absolutely advocate. This is something that can turn useless dead rock into wonderful life-sustaining world. That is a purely altruistic intent right there, and in fact is the kind of thing that you could see the Federation leaping on board with. As soon as, even at the very thought of it being possible, it's very likely that Starfleet was like, yes, please. Or the Federation was like, yes, please. Now, it makes sense they would classify the hell out of it, because of my final point. This is something that could be a literal planet-destroying scale weapon in the hands of someone who wanted to use it for non-altruistic reasons. That's why it is such a wonderful Tetris block. It fits all three of these requirements beautifully. It is a horribly devastating weapon on a planetary scale, a wonderfully beautiful life-giving device on a planetary scale, and helps flesh out the setting and really show what kind of a world we're living in. And I love it for this reason. Michael Miner's inclusion into it was a stroke of genius. So, let's talk about the first battle. Reliant is on approach to the Enterprise. A lot of people have criticized Kirk's actions here. Now, rightfully so, because he makes the wrong decision. But they call him stupid for it, and that I disagree with. Kirk made a mistake. Kirk admits he made a mistake. But I don't think he was being stupid. I think he was being flawed. Look at it from his perspective. Now, from our perspective, there's something I've talked about before, and I'm going to only touch on it very briefly here. It's why zombie apocalypses are always so horrifying in character when they aren't out of character. And that reason is because of the fact that we know what a zombie apocalypse is. We've seen it in fiction 100 bajillion trillion times. So we would have some kind of emotional and mental barrier if one actually happened. In character, those people in those settings didn't have zombie fiction. It just all of a sudden happened, and therefore it was the unthinkable, the unknowable. And therefore that's why they react the way they did. World War Z was a great example of this. I know I keep talking about that damn book, but it just keeps being relevant. It was a wonderful example of what I'm talking about. They reacted the way they did because there was no zombie fiction in that setting. And therefore, oh my god, the living have started biting and spreading, and oh my god. That's an unthinkable thought, because they weren't prepared for it. Nothing in fiction prepared them for it. So we, again, here in, real life, we've seen, okay, someone's approaching us quietly and otherwise unobservantly. We would get suspicious. We would get nervous. We would get paranoid. How many people out there play D&D? I'll raise my hand here. How many of you play D&D as a very paranoid character, especially those of you who've played it for a long time? You see someone who's like, hey, I'm here to help you, and your first thought is, what's he planning? We get that kind of thing because we have that fictional mental and emotional barrier that gives us that kind of experience. But people in fiction almost always do not have that barrier. So Kirk does not see the approach of Reliant as suspicious. Why would he? I mean, that's Captain Teller? Damn, I can't think of it. Oh my god, I can't think of the name of the character. He is such a great character, too. That's the captain's ship, right? That's the ship Tekhov's on. Maybe they know something about what's going on with this whole Genesis situation. Now, yes, he did make a mistake, but it's easy to see from his eyes why he saw the situation as relatively normal. They come over, and keep in mind that the sequence of events it's difficult to see because of the limitations of directile style. So let me lay this out for you, because Nicholas Meyer actually talked about this, okay? From Kirk's perspective, there's the Reliant. It's on approach. They slow down, seeing the Enterprise, and they do a nice casual flyby kind of a situation, which, you know, okay, whatever. And they're having comm trouble, so they're not sending any communication signals. Okay, whatever. Apparently, they get a message finally that actually, you know, through the static, once the Reliant gets closer, they get a message through the static now that they're closer saying, we're having a problem with our emissions coil. He turns to Spock. Spock says, there's no emissions coil, and they're raising shields. Huh? And then they're raising weapons, and then they attack. All of that happens in the matter of seconds. Not enough time to really prepare Enterprise for the attack. Now, you'd be like, well, that's not how it happens in the movie, but that is the limitation of the medium, because it wants to show us what's happening on the Reliant and on the Enterprise at the same time. But rather than doing a kind of a split-screen thing, the action jumps back and forth, but each time it jumps, you're actually going back in time about 2 seconds to what happened in the previous scene on the other side. Does that make sense? So in other words, the reaction time Kirk had is actually fully understandable, and one of the reasons why the Enterprise was hit so hard and, in his own words, cut with his britches down. I just felt like sharing that because I've heard a lot of people make fun of that scene a lot, and that's just my take on it. So, Star Trek Online is a great game that I recommend you play if you like Star Trek, but it also took a lot of its inspiration from the Star Trek movies in particular, and this movie in many ways shaped how combat works in STO. One of the biggest things that came out of it is the fact that the distance you are from your target changes how much damage you do to it. Now that sounds normal, but that idea was fleshed out here, because remember, Reliant, here's the Enterprise, and here's Reliant. Reliant's like right here. In spatial terms, this is like being so close to someone your hands are in their pocket, right? I mean, you're right there. So this is effectively a point-blank phaser blast on a ship that has its shields down. It is no wonder Enterprise was so destructively badly crippled by this attack that they were basically incapable of even functioning, let alone moving, after this attack. It is a miracle the Enterprise was not actually destroyed in that initial attack, in all honesty. I just felt like mentioning that because it makes a lot of sense, and again, inspired the STO thing. So I mentioned the great directorial style. There's amazing energy in these scenes. Everyone's moving. Stuff is happening. Things are... It's not just the shaky cam. It's not just the lens flares or anything like that. There's actual energy and movement and action going on in the scenes, even though we're just seeing the inside of the ship, which is engaged in active combat. I mentioned that earlier. Just thought I'd point it out again. One other thing to point out, though, that really helps make these scenes make sense. This is a cadet crew. Scotty actually points out a line later, which is more significant than most people seem to think. This is later, after the battle's over. He stayed at his post while all the others ran, while the other cadets ran. Untested crew. Young. Inexperienced. Don't know what they're doing. You see how this makes sense? This is a ship that might have been able to respond a little bit better if it had an experienced crew on board. But it didn't. How many of those people who fled their posts might have been able to help salvage the Enterprise if they hadn't? And it is no wonder why they didn't, because after all, he does lose his life for doing that. But I mention that out because, again, inexperienced crew, caught by surprise. It's no wonder that the Constitution class, you know, the Enterprise, is taken so far down. But of course it makes sense for out-of-character perspective as well. You need to level the playing field between the Reliant and the Enterprise. Otherwise, the Enterprise will obliterate the Reliant. So you level the playing field by damaging the Enterprise and to the point of being crippled, and then you level it by damaging the Reliant to the point of being damaged. That brings the originally they're like this. That brings the Enterprise down to here, and the Reliant to about right here. Really help level the playing field, which is the real purpose of this initial battle. So then Khan makes what is arguably his biggest mistake in the whole movie. Remember I mentioned earlier that fixation, that obsession. It's no wonder he makes this mistake because he literally can't do elsewise. He cannot just obliterate Kirk and be satisfied with it. Not after 15 years. No, 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 no. Especially because he knows for a certainty that Kirk, Admiral Kirk, has probably never even thought about him since then. In all actual fact, based on his lines, I imagine Khan was calling him up, expecting to not even be recognized. But then he is pleasantly surprised. Oh, you do recognize me. And then because he recognizes him, he just starts to gloat, because this is exactly what Khan wanted. For Kirk to realize and recognize who had beaten him, who had bested him, and then to savor the moment. And then Khan allows Kirk to come over with all his information on Genesis. Here's a question for you. Would Khan have destroyed the Enterprise after doing so? In my opinion, absolutely. Yes. Why? Not because he has any animosity towards the Enterprise. Not because it's tactically sound to do so. Not for any other reason. Not just evil for evil's sake. He would do it because all Khan cares about at this moment is hurting Kirk. What is there that would hurt Kirk more than destroying the Enterprise right in front of his eyes? What exists that would be more painful to Kirk in Khan's mind? Because there are things more painful. But for Khan's perspective, there's nothing worse for Kirk. So he would drag him up to the bridge, make him watch as he destroyed the Enterprise, piecemeal, bit by bit, with the comm open. And then he'd probably kill Kirk and then be satisfied. So then we have the wonderful, wonderful moment where we see the difference in age yet again. Remember, the Enterprise was caught by surprise because of that age problem. But one of the other things that age grants when you actually have it is experience. Khan is intelligent. His people are intelligent enough to pick up how to use a ship made years after they were sent into exile. Keeping in mind, they never exactly had any practice with the original Enterprise either. Remember that? Back in Space Seed, they took over the ship, but were still trying to figure out how the ship functioned. So this is a crew of people who have managed to be able to figure out how to get the Reliant functioning and working with basically no training or time whatsoever. So very intelligent. But intelligence does not mean experience. And so they don't actually know how to deal with certain types of things immediately. They don't know how to be prepared for certain types of attacks. That's why they could do the command code. That's why that plan is outthinking your enemy, rather than Deus Ex Machinaing or technobabbling your way to victory. This is not a technobabble solution. This is, we have experience, they have skill, we're going to use our experience to hit them in a way they couldn't expect and level the playing field. And that's exactly what happens. Brilliant writing. So Scotty brings Preston to the bridge. Why? I hate to say that because it is a very powerful scene, and I'll talk about it in a moment. But Scotty bringing the damaged Preston to the bridge makes no sense whatsoever, no matter how you look at it, unless the turbo lift is literally malfunctioning. He should be going straight to sickbay. That being said, as I said before, it is a flaw. It is a mistake in the movie. But I'm willing to acknowledge it because the potency of that scene is hard to deny. Kirk's reaction, Savik's reaction, and most importantly of all, Spock's reaction. Seeing personally a member of his crew, his training crew, dying in front of his eyes, moves him, as it should. I like that scene, even if it makes no sense. Let's talk theories. We know that Spock was supposed to die earlier in the film. This is a fact. We know that the circumstances of Spock's death are they had a ticking timer towards destruction, that the ship was out of power, and it involved engineering. These are the facts that exist, okay? If we look at the way that this scene is constructed, we do have a possible explanation for why Preston was brought to the bridge rather than elsewhere. Because what are the circumstances of this first battle but a ticking clock towards destruction, given by Khan, them being at main power, debilitating the ship, and the problem in engineering, which is why they're out of main power. This is not a new theory. If this is the first time you're hearing this, I apologize. I have heard several people postulate on this theory. Believe it or not, I've never actually seen anyone confirm what Meyer's original death is, but based on the evidence, me and many other Trekkers and Trekkies tend to agree Spock was supposed to die in this first battle, in this scene. It makes the most sense thematically and structurally. And there's a lot more evidence in favor of this. For example, the tone of many future scenes, one of which I'll be talking about in detail in a few, is completely changed if you assume that instead of Preston dying, it was Spock. And that tone kind of seems consistent with the way those scenes are structured. Furthermore, Spock has effectively a non-role from this point until his sacrifice. Everything he is doing is just giving status reports or basic concepts, things that could be done by just about anyone else on the bridge crew. Spock has no real role in the movie from this point until its end. Finally, it makes sense from the way that Meyer originally constructed his grand tragedy. have the death happen in the middle, hit Kirk right across the knees, and then have him have to struggle back up from that in order to try and salvage the best of his humanity in the way that Khan failed to. It also makes the rest of the movie a much darker movie, I might add. Whether or not it's true or not, I don't know and probably never will. But I mention this here because having rethought on this thought a lot, even before I rewatched the movie, I was thinking about this exact same thing, because I've known about this theory for years and years. Is the movie better for the change? Now, that's always going to come down to an opinion. But in my opinion, I think the answer is yes. Because Spock's death in the middle of the film certainly changes the overall tone of the rest of the film, but his death at the end of the film serves as a wonderful climax, and it leads into one of the other changes to this script that happened that I will talk about eventually when I finally get to the end of this video. It also serves as a natural conclusion of all four of the themes of the film, which I'll be talking about when we get to there. If it happened here, it could be tied into and segued as part of those four themes. Age, obvious, as I already mentioned. Death, again, obvious, no need to mention it. The no-win scenario, again, very obvious. And of course, obsession. Doesn't tie into obsession quite as well. But I'll talk about that later. So feel free to tell me what you guys think, if it would have been better or worse, you think, for Spock to die here. So, question. Why not use the rock, the moon, Regula, for the Genesis experiment? Now, you might be like, huh? Because it's funny, because they actually end up doing this unintentionally at the end of the film, combining the nebula and the moon into the new Genesis planet. But why didn't they do that to begin with? Why were they off searching for some lifeless planet when they've got one literally right there? Which they already know the Genesis device works in because they've already done that. That always bothered me a little bit. Where am I? Another thing that does actually bother me a little bit. Why does Spock using a coded transmission makes tons of sense, but the code is something that a 5-year-old could probably decode. In fact, even when I was a kid watching this, a little older than 5, I remember thinking, huh? I mean, that's obviously in code. Why does Khan not pick up on that? He even emphasizes it by saying, by the book, by the book, by the book. And it's like, no, Spock, a little bit of subtlety, man. Just a little niggle there. I like how quickly Kirk realizes, I keep writing Jim, I like how quickly Kirk realizes that that is his son. All he needs is the fact that that's Dr. Marcus. And then he just backs up and he's like, oh my god. Because he hasn't seen his son in forever, remember. Really good scene there. So one thing I both like and dislike about the following scene. It's mentioned that the eel that gets up there in your brain makes you susceptible to suggestion, but is not true mind control. I mentioned earlier how Paul Winfield plays his character as someone who is genuinely horrified and terrified of the things he does, but he's so suggestible that he can't help but keep doing what he is told to do, right? Well, that's cool, and I like it, and it also explains why he refuses to kill in cold blood with his hand. Again, it's that personal versus distance thing. He is being told to kill someone right here, right now, who is in front of him. And it's a lot harder for any human to do that under normal circumstances, let alone a Starfleet captain. And so he actually manages to resist the urge and shoots himself instead. A very powerful scene, which is then followed by the eel leaving Chekhov's ear. To this date, I have never, ever heard an actual explanation that has been given for why that eel just leaves his ear that doesn't just kind of make stuff up. The two explanations I've heard most often are A, it sensed the danger somehow. I have no idea how, but whatever. And B, that all the eels eventually leave the brain and move on. But if that's true, why does having an eel in there lead to madness and death, as Khan mentioned? This can be explained away, but it's just an interesting scene and obviously exists so that Chekhov doesn't die. Not that I want Chekhov to die, but So, I mentioned this back in my Empire Strikes Back video. It's easy to look back at something with 30 plus years of parody and comedy and aping and using it in different circumstances and to lose the impact of the original. So when I rewatched this, I was actually like curious what my reaction would be to the Khan scene, you know, when he shouts Khan. To my surprise, I actually found it to be properly dramatically potent. And for two reasons I'll go into really quickly. One, The most obvious one. Kirk is genuinely enraged at this point in time. At this point, he's already pissed off at Khan for the loss of Preston, for the damaging to his ship, for the killing of the scientist on Regula, and then he sees a good Starfleet captain and one of his friends injured by this, and he's just... The way he talks, Khan, you bloodsucker, he is pissed. So his rage is coming through in that. But the second reason I like it is because it's a bit of a misdirection. He wants Khan to feel like he has won, so that Khan will move on from that. So Kirk pours his real rage into screaming his name as if Khan has won, and then lets it go. Because Kirk has other plans, remember. But all that being said, Kirk is a hammy actor. No offense intended. I actually like actors who know how to ham it up well. And that's the thing. Any actor can act in a hammy fashion, chewing up the scenery, as it's sometimes called. But pulling that off well, I feel, is something that only some actors can really do. And I've always felt that Shatner, when he is directed properly, can pull off a very appropriately good hammy performance. And I think the way he shouts Khan is actually really good, as opposed to, say, the way it was done in Into Darkness, where it lacks any of the dramatic impact or potential that this one did. Just my opinion on it. Hang on, looking at my notes here. Khan says he wants to do worse than kill Kirk. He wants to hurt you. Keep that in the back of your mind for a while. I'll be talking about that a little bit later. In this video, don't worry. I mentioned Carol Marcus. I guess I don't have anything else actually to say about her. She is considerate, she is driven, she's brilliant, she's intelligent, she's insightful. She is exactly what she should be. It's a shame she has so small of a role, relatively speaking, in the film. Crucial role, but relatively small in terms of screen time, because the actress who pulls it off, whose name I do not know how to pronounce, forgive me, does a great job of it. And it is a damn shame, because Nicholas Meyer himself said she pulled it off brilliantly, and I agree completely. What follows is one of my favorite sequences in movie history. Right up there with the scene with the confrontation between Luke the Emperor and Vader in Return of the Jedi, or the confrontation between Vader and Luke in Empire Strikes Back. This is one of those scenes, one of my top 10 scenes in movie history. This scene that follows gives us James T. Kirk, really shows us James T. Kirk in a way that arguably everything else never really fully got across, because it is the full array of who he is as a person. As he's sitting there, defeated... Well, no, rewind a bit. First thing he does is he acts a bit flippant. Maybe a bit defensive, but overall, he has that lighthearted, semi-humorous, charismatic tone to him. Because James T. Kirk is very charismatic, and he knows how to put other people at ease. It's one of his command-style things, a very fatherly approach kind of thing. Kind of like how Riker would later be, in all honesty. So he kind of does this nice little thing. Go get some food. I don't know about you, but I'm starving. Nice little diffuse the moment kind of a thing. But when they're gone, and he's just there with Carol, all of that fades, and you can see all of that bitterness and that age and that defeatism just wearing on his face. I feel old, he says. He admits that he feels old. He has made a mistake. He has made horrible mistakes. This is a scene that would be tremendously changed and darkened if Spock had died in that earlier thing. Imagine what it would mean to Kirk to sit there on that, whatever he's sitting on, and admit that because he made a mistake, because he was flawed, because he was human, because he was old, because he had failed, his best friend was now dead. And so he's sitting there, and again, while William Shatner is a wonderfully hammy actor, the few times, and it does happen every now and again, when he is directed to be quiet and barely whispering, he can be so powerful in his performance, and he does it right here brilliantly. But this is not the full capacity of Kirk's character arc. Remember, so much of Kirk's strength comes from his reliance on his crew. He is not the hero, he is the captain. He is the one who, and a captain is only a captain with a ship and a crew that he knows he can rely and depend upon. All of his strength comes from that connection between them. And so, with all of his confidence in his crew, all of his confidence in his ship, is what helps buoy him and support him. It's no wonder that when they are absent and he's just sitting there with Carol, the human, the woman he actually thought about leaving Starfleet for, that he can allow himself to simply be the man rather than the captain. But that leads to the final part of his arc. He goes into the Genesis cave, which is wonderful, beautiful, great stuff. It's the only visual effect in the entire movie Nicholas Meyer was unsatisfied with, just as an anecdote. He goes into that cave, and, you know, Saavik, who has been asking him about this the entire movie, this is like the third or fourth time she's brought it up, asks him about the Kobayashi Maru, which ties into that theme again. And Kirk reveals the final aspect of his character arc. He doesn't believe in the no-win scenario. Now, I want to explain this. I was going into Lowe's earlier, just rehearsing this part of this video in my head, because I knew I was going to talk about this. When I say that Kirk believes in this, I don't mean that flippantly. I don't mean like, okay, the word belief tends to be tossed around a little bit too much. When I say this word belief now, I mean a core element principle of one's existence. In other words, from Kirk's perspective, there literally is no such thing as a no-win scenario. It's not that he doesn't believe in it, yeah, whatever. No, he knows in the core element of his being that there is no such thing as a no-win scenario. And that is integral to the way his character functions. He will always find some way to make things work, some way to work around it, some way to cheat the rules. His reaction to the Kobayashi Maru test says that in spades. He changed the conditions of the test. Now, you can call that cheating, you can call that bypassing it, but when you look at it from his perspective, it makes perfect sense for Kirk, the character. This is a no-win scenario. Well, those don't exist. How do I know that? Because I can work around it. And he did. And he made it work. Got a commendation for it, for God's sakes. And then they reprogrammed the test so you couldn't do that anymore. That is James T. Kirk in a nutshell. He will always find some way around it, despite the weight of the burden, despite his reliance on his crew, despite his trust and friendship, his flippancy, his skill with doing things, his capacity to think on his feet, and all of it boils down to that one thing. I don't believe in the no-win scenario. And then they get beamed up. Wonderful scene. I love that whole sequence. It's the reason it's among my favorite in, like, movie history. God. There's another wonderful little tidbit, which I want you to remember until Star Trek 6, and that is that Saavik turns to Spock and says, with almost injury in her voice, "You lied." And Spock says, "I exaggerated." Remember that for Star Trek 6. Just keep it in the back of your mind, would you? Make a note here for myself. There's great pacing leading up to the Nebula battle. And including the Nebula battle itself. The pacing is all about, you know, building the energy, getting the ship going. Oh my God, and they're right there, and the music's right with it. And then when they actually hit the Nebula, it all goes quiet. Now, a brief anecdote before I go forward. I keep saying anecdote today. I don't know why. A brief little tidbit. Why is David Marcus allowed on the bridge? I mean, really, why is he there on a bridge in a combat situation? That's just kind of weird. Now, I know why it is. It's so he can identify the Genesis wave when he sees it. That's the out-of-character reason. But why is he allowed in character? Whatever. Moving on. The battle sequence of the Mutara Nebula is considered by some to be one of the best battle sequences in Star Trek history. I definitely agree it is one of the best Star Trek battles ever. I'm not going to say it's the best. I'd have to really think about that. But it's up there. And the reason why, it is beautifully quiet. It is an old submarine battle, but all the worse for it. Both ships are effectively blind. Both ships are effectively weak. Both ships have been beaten and battered. Remember I mentioned earlier, Enterprise is here, Reliant is here. The Mutara Nebula brings them back to be completely equal. Two equally matched individuals and opponents. And even the movie itself gets quiet. It doesn't go full submarine level, but the music gets very chilling and very tense. And everyone on the bridge just has that constant, you know, that pose as if they are just... That tension is palpable in the atmosphere. Even on Khan's bridge, it's like that. It's also fascinating because, first of all, the two-dimensional thinking comment makes a lot of sense. And again, ties back into that experience thing. I'll get that in just a moment. But another one, there's a very real risk in this nebula of actually having a collision with the other ship. And without shields, that would probably be fatal for both ships, in all honesty. A starship collision is kind of a big deal. And again, no shields. So, yeah, that's another thing to add to the tension, and one of the reasons why I feel both ships were so tense during the course of this. So, Spock has a comment. He is very intelligent, but not experienced. Now, I've been mentioning this, and again, this ties into that theme of age, right? But I mention it not just for the theme of age, but for one other aspect of it. One of the things I've always felt when it comes to... Okay, for those of you who don't know, amongst geekdom, one of the things most commonly discussed is who would win A versus B. Now, those discussions can be interesting because there's so many variables to consider, and there's a lot to think about. So it's a very engaging intellectual discussion, right? At least if you're doing it right. So one of the things that's always fascinating about that, though, for me, is the vast gulf of difference between skill and power. For example, someone says who's stronger, A or B, but stronger has to be defined. Because in terms of raw power, this person might be stronger, but this person over here is much less powerful, but knows how to use their power much, much better. You know, I've talked about this with regards to Star Wars extensively, for example, and will when we get to the KOTOR lore run, which, who knows, maybe going right now. That would be great if that's happening right now. That would make me so happy. By your times, when you're watching this now. And obviously, it's not going on my now. So, Khan has way more power than Kirk does, in basically every way. Better ship, well, at least at this point in time, effectively an equivalent ship, but overall a ship that's in better shape. He's smarter, he's stronger, he's, you know, all that stuff. Kirk has better skill. Kirk has less, but knows how to use it better. He has that experience, that wisdom to temper his intellect. And it's a wonderful way to balance the two out, and again, tie in with the theme of aging, as I mentioned earlier. So then Khan loses and activates the Genesis device. Why does he do this? If Khan had accepted being taken prisoner, he would have been treated, he would have been sent to prison, and he would have almost invariably found some way to either escape, or to wreak havoc in the future, or to reclaim power, or to pretend rehabilitation. In other words, he could have had some kind of a future. He chose not to. He chose not to. But I don't think he could have made any other choice at this point in time. One of the things I've talked about before when it comes to character motivation is, imagine if you're reaching out and you want something, and you go to reach it, and it's snatched from your hands. Before you might have wanted it, but now you really want it. Now it's bothering you that you didn't get it. So you go to reach it again, and it's snatched away again. And now it's really getting to you. This is a very simple way to explain what is effectively a very complex human emotion process. In other words, something can increase in relative importance to you, or how much it bothers you, or how much it affects you, the more it impacts you. Let me use revenge as an example. Let's say you hurt me, so I want to hurt you, but I fail, and you hurt me again. Now you've hurt me twice, and I failed, so now I'm pissed off, and now I go after you again, but then I fail again, and again, and again, and each time it gets worse. By the end of this movie, I don't think Khan was actually sane in any sense of the word, and I don't think he had the actual capacity to do anything other than try to hurt Kirk one last time, which is what he does. He activates the Genesis device. There's no benefit to him for this. There's no possible future for them. He is killing himself, literally. But he does it anyways, because damn it, I'm going to hurt you. I love the fact that Spock wastes absolutely no time in making his decision. As soon as he realizes the situation, as soon as he realizes Scotty isn't responding, he gets up and goes down to engineering. Bam, just like that. One of the things I like best about this movie is the unsaid things. Kirk is very blatant about his belief that there is no such thing as the no-win scenario. But what I love about this movie is that Spock has that same belief. Spock also agrees there is no such thing as the no-win scenario. He says it differently. The way he says it is, there are always possibilities. But his actions indicate this as well. His actions indicate that he does not believe that there is such a thing as a no-win scenario, that he will find a way around the Kobayashi Maru, find a way to beat it, find a way to trick it. He even reveals he never actually took the test back in Starfleet. So then Spock goes into the thing, and we see all of those themes tied up into his death in his final scene. Age and experience. He approaches McCoy and knows he can't talk him out of it, so he just puts him down. He knows how to fix that engineer. He knows he's the only one to do it. He knows that his life is a small price to pay for those others. He has come to believe this over the course of his life. He has the experience to understand that. He has the perspective to think that the lives of the young are more worth the lives of the old, or the life of the old in this case. His obsession, Spock has always been committed to serving. Whether that's altruism or good intention is more debatable, but there is no questioning the fact that Spock definitely has always wanted to benefit others, to serve. And the ultimate service can often be seen as this kind of self-sacrifice. The willingness to do so, and again, without hesitation, to put his life down and say, yes, my final action will be in service of my crew and my friends. The theme of death is powerful and obvious here, but not just in the death of Spock himself, but rather, in addition to that, the way that his death will affect others and Spock's acknowledgement of that. I have been and always shall be your friend. He wanted Kirk to know that. It's one of his final words. And his very final words are live long and prosper. He wanted Kirk to keep going. He wanted his friend to keep going, to not be weighted down by his passing. Because he knew he would. He understood that. And that, of course, ties into the final theme, the no-win scenario. Because there is no such thing. Which, ironically, also wonderfully ties into Star Trek 3 in its own wonderful way. And the actual Star Trek theme, the theme for Star Trek, plays as Spock dies, and then slowly trails off into a grief, low-key melody. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. This is how you kill a main character. This is probably the example of killing a main character in, like, all of fiction, in my opinion. You kill them as a natural, in Meyer's own words, an organic growth of the themes of the work. It has to flow into all of the themes of the work. It has to move organically. It has to be one of those things where you don't even see it until it's on you. And none of us did. Until he went to there and we were just like, oh no. A couple final notes. I'm almost done, I swear. Interesting little note that everyone is either looking down or straight at attention when Spock's funeral is playing. Carol is not. Carol is looking at Kirk. It's one of her final pieces, but it really helps emphasize how close the two of them really were, and it really still are. The fact that she is just gazing at him, and she can see how hurt he is and how wounded he is because of this. Which brings me to my final point, or rather my final point about the themes. Khan has his revenge. Remember I said earlier, keep that in the back of your mind. I don't want to kill you, I want to hurt you. Khan has his revenge because he takes Spock from Kirk. Khan never even knew he had his revenge. Isn't that ironic? But the symbolism is beautiful. Obvious, but still very beautiful in my opinion. He has his glasses from McCoy, and he has his book from Spock. And he goes to read the book, and he can't because his glasses are broken, damaged in the attack. His glasses which let him see better, just like his best friend who always let him see better. By his presence, by his wisdom, by his experience. Wonderful scene. And then his son comes in, David. And Kirk admits that I know nothing. The line, I know nothing, was something Meyer had adamant in his mind. Before he even wrote the rest of the script, he knew one of the culmination lines of the entire script would be that line by Kirk, I know nothing. It goes all the way back to that Greek word I mentioned earlier, peripeteia. The idea of the hero acknowledging their own flaws and admitting that they were wrong and they were flawed and they were human. That is this scene in a nutshell. Kirk admitting, I know nothing. I have failed. I cheated death. I bypassed death and patted myself on the back for my cleverness. But I like David's rejoinder to that. The way we deal with death is at least as important as how we deal with life. Kirk normally dealt with death by bypassing and sidestepping it. And the unspoken of thing here is that Kirk is at his heart a good man. That he tried to bypass and trick and stop death for the sake of others, for the sake of helping and taking care of and doing good. And though he is now facing the real death of one of his friends, he is dealing with it as clearly and strongly as he can with the sake of his other friends who are still with him, those bonds of fellowship keeping them going. And McCoy's wonderful line, he's never really dead as long as we remember him, which turned out to be wonderfully ironic, although nobody knew that at the time. For the record, that was not written with Star Trek 3 in mind. So let me set the record straight on that. And then there's Spock's final message. I mentioned that book all the way back, the very beginning of the film. He gives him A Tale of Two Cities. Forgive me for the paraphrasing. This is from memory. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better place I go to than I have ever been. That was Spock's real message. Remember I mentioned how Spock says, no message that I'm aware of. Well, there was a message, and that was it. And that was his message to Kirk. And Kirk expresses the fact that he has understood that message, which is his final line. I feel young. That he can still go out there and do. He can still go out there and be. That he is not merely some has-been, some relic, or some antique, but he is still a man, flawed, but capable. Final thoughts. Because of the... I mentioned earlier, Roddenberry did the right thing for the wrong reasons. I don't remember if I extrapolated on that fully, so let me just lay it out right here. If the script had not been changed, we would not have gotten Spock back in Star Trek 3. There's one other thing that added to that. With the script revision and the changing of Spock's death, obviously Spock died at the end with the Genesis planet, but one other thing was changed with the script, okay? And that is the fact that when they went to test the movie, people saw the test footage, which is basically unfinished footage, mostly just recordings with, boom mics and no lighting effects or whatsoever, no polish whatsoever. And everyone thought it was a great film, but it was testing really badly with regards to the ending. Why? Because it was a grand tragedy. Remember I mentioned that all the way back at the beginning. Meyer developed this as a grand tragedy, and it was supposed to end tragically, as all tragedies do. The ending was altered and shifted because almost 100% of the audience were literally left in tears. And they were like, no, that can't be the end. They wanted hope. They wanted the possibility of being able to keep going on after this. This is how the ending to Star Trek II was changed. And they added that tiny little tidbit with the mind meld and the word remember, which was originally designed to be basically a dropped thread, which I'll be talking about a lot more when we get to Deep Space Nine, because they did that writing policy all over the place in Deep Space Nine. But basically, it was something that was written there so that something could be done with it, but no plans were made to do something with it. It's like a weird approach to continuity. You leave a thread dangling on purpose so someone else can connect it, but you don't actually have a plan for it. Make sense? And then they added the thing with the torpedo being on the Genesis planet. So the audience could at least have that hope that something would happen. I mention this because it is adamantly important for you to understand that they never intended for Spock to be resurrected. And I feel like this is one of the reasons his death still has impact to this day. Because they do kill Spock, but then they bring him back. By the way, spoiler alert, I probably should have said that, I'm sorry. Point being, they bring him back. The fact that they bring him back would normally take away some of the power and strength of that. And for people who have rewatched this series, I've noticed they have that same impact. They're like, oh, well, of course they're going to bring him back, because that's what people do in fiction nowadays in general. They kill characters and they bring them back, and they kill them and bring them back. Star Trek does this itself all over the place. But that was never the design or intent, and I feel like that actually helps because the strength and gravity of his death is therefore not lessened, because it was always intended for him to just plain die, and then they spend an entire movie trying to bring him back. And I can't help but notice, from the perspective of someone who watched this stuff when it was coming out, none of us knew he was going to come back. In fact, I will mention something in my Star Trek 3 video. They actually kind of hinted and kept things under the wraps about whether or not Spock would be coming back in Star Trek 3. Even though it was called The Search for Spock, we weren't sure they were going to succeed. But I digress. Just a little historical perspective. I hope you've enjoyed what I consider one of the top 28 movies of all time, and my second favorite Star Trek movie of all time. Live long and prosper.